Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Undying Fire, Truth and Lies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1, Truth and Lies. Leaving the Northern Water Tribe had been a relief for Aang. The warriors had been in an uproar when it was revealed that Prince Zuko had escaped, furious that their enemy and at least Farilak and his supporters' supposed bargaining tool with the Fire Lord had slipped free from their grasp. Only Master Pakku had not seemed to care, stating that he was not going to let one escaped prince get in the way of his plans to help rebuild the Southern Water Tribe. He suggested that Aang and the others should do the same and offered to take them as far with him on the boat as he could before they had to depart for the Earth Kingdom base. So it was that Aang and his friends had set sail with Master Pakku and the selected group of Northern Water Tribe warriors and healers. Yagoda had not come, which Aang knew had upset Katara at first. However, the elderly healer had given her plenty of scrolls to study to keep improving her healing techniques. Yagoda had also advised that whether Katara became a true master of healing or not would depend on her intuitive and chi manipulation abilities. Theory was good, but healing was a more spiritual art at the end of the day. That was why powerful healers were rare, even among the Northern Water Tribe where all female waterbenders were forced to learn the art. Aang had discovered for himself that, despite being the Avatar, he could not make his waterbending heal even the smallest bruise. He felt sorry for the girls who also had no knack for the talent. It was his hope that they would be allowed to learn combative waterbending, like Katara had done. He didn't like to think of benders not being able to use their element just because they couldn't pick up a skill the tribe had decreed to be the only suitable form for a female. It just didn't seem right. Musing about right and wrong got Aang thinking about his own problem, the one he had been desperately trying to ignore ever since he and Zuko had talked in the cell. As the Avatar, it was his duty to maintain balance and to protect the people around him. He had thought he had been doing that during the Siege of the North, but now he wasn't so certain. Every time he slept, he had nightmares where he was back in the Avatar state, only this time he was attacking himself. It was scary. He was scary. Aang squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the images. He didn't want to dwell on those dreams. He didn't want to dwell on that night. There were some things that he could not deny, even though he desperately wished it were otherwise. Shredded pieces of metal could not unite again to form hundreds of warships. Bloated, frozen bodies could not renew with warmth and life. It would be easy enough to connect the pieces, to combine the angry words that had been thrown at his face with the whispered fragments of truth that, deep down, his heart already knew. But Aang refused to let his mind wander down that path. It was too painful, like a bruise throbbing at the slightest touch. This will hurt you, his mind seemed to say. You don't want to search too deep. And he didn't. He really didn't. But that didn't stop the nightmares from haunting him even when he was awake. Aang. It was Katara. He gripped the ship railing and stared towards the darkened ocean as she came to stand beside him. For a moment neither said anything. She placed her hand on his shoulder and the warmth of her touch sank right through into his skin, filling him with a sense of comfort. Katara always knew how to make him feel better. Do you want to talk about it? She asked gently. He shook his head. It was just a nightmare. You've been having them a lot lately. Aang said nothing. He knew it was true. She sighed and let her hand drop back to her side. Come on, Aang. We should get some sleep. We'll be heading to the Earth Kingdom base tomorrow. Yeah. He gave one last look at the ocean, then turned and headed back to the cabin. When he fell asleep, the nightmares still haunted him. Oh. Zuko examined the white lotus tile resting on his palm. It had been a week since he had first set out on the raft. In that time, he had simply tried to survive. When he was not focused on keeping his raft and body intact, he worked on figuring out the riddle that had been his mysterious helper's final message. Follow the path of the ancient ways and you will find what you are seeking, Zuko repeated, having memorized the note long ago. He growled in frustration and stuffed the tile back in his pocket. I don't understand. He didn't know what the ancient ways were. He wasn't even certain if he knew what the note had meant by finding what he was seeking. He had been searching for the Avatar for almost 3 years, but somehow that didn't fit. All he had to help him was the dagger and a white lotus tile, two things that he associated strongly with his uncle. It was that connection which had him so frustrated now. In his heart, he believed the message was a clue to finding his uncle, the person he was indeed seeking, but Zuko had might as well have been trying to decipher a different language for all the sense he could make of it. Why does everything have to be in riddles? He grumbled, letting his arms rest on his knees as he leaned back against the mast. If people just spoke plainly, he might already have an idea of where to begin his search. Instead, he was stuck trying to figure out what the ancient ways might be and why his anonymous helper had given him a pie show tile of all things. He also couldn't help but wonder why someone in the Northern Water Tribe had chosen to help him in the first place, let alone given him, or so he hoped, clues as to how he might find his uncle. Zuko closed his eyes, feeling the sun caress his face. It pained him to admit it, but he knew that the Avatar would have tried to help him break out of prison, yet the note and the careful way the escape route had been planned was much too subtle for that airhead, or for any of the Avatar's friends for that matter. He did wonder if perhaps the healer, Yugo-Da, might have had something to do with his escape. For all he'd got frustrated with her, she had been kind to him in her own way, and he had not forgotten that she had been the one holding onto his dagger. Still, he had got the impression that she did not know how to fight, and someone had taken out all the guards. His brow creased. Was it that old guy then? The one with the piercing eyes who had come to warn him and asked weird questions? Zuko sighed and stretched his legs out more. Maybe he'd never know who had helped him, but he wished he could at least unravel the stupid message. That was all he really cared about right now, and surviving. I hope I find land soon, he muttered. He'd been lucky enough to have good winds to push him along for most of the week, but he wasn't sure how much longer his supplies would last, even with all of the rationing he'd been doing. The stars told him that he was at least heading towards the Earth Kingdom, but he had little choice but to let the current take his raft where it willed. One sail and a paddle could only do so much in terms of helping him navigate the ocean. It was just fortunate that he could swim and was well and truly used to being tossed around in choppy waters. He could have done without the circling sea vultures, though. Zuko exhaled and got back to his feet, picking up the paddle as he did. No sense in sitting around. He had to be quick if he wanted to catch up to his uncle. Then I'm coming for you, Avatar, he thought grimly. Oh. The Earth Kingdom base had not been what Aang was expecting. General Fong had greeted them with high praise and an impressive display of fireworks, but the cheery atmosphere had not lasted. As soon as they had been called into the general's private room, Aang had begun to feel uncomfortable. The general kept talking about the great victory Aang had achieved in the north, oblivious to Aang's mixed feelings regarding the subject. Then, to the shock of all, he had declared that Aang was ready to face the Fire Lord. Aang could still remember the distinct jolt of horror he had felt upon hearing those words, the horror he had continued to feel as the general went on to explain that the powers he gained by entering the Avatar state would be more than enough to defeat the Fire Lord. With the Avatar leading the head of the army as the ultimate weapon, the Earth Kingdom could cut a swath right through to the heart of the Fire Nation. Nothing would be able to stop them. It was a foolproof plan, and the general was not going to take no for an answer. In vain had Aang tried to explain that he did not know how to get in or out of the Avatar state, let alone control it. In vain had Katara stated that Aang needed to be focusing on learning the elements. The general had listened to all with deaf ears, and then, when their protests had fallen silent, he had shown them the infirmary. In his mind, Aang could still see the injured Earth Kingdom soldiers. Some of them had missing limbs while others had been badly burnt. Some had not been moving at all. Those are the lucky ones, General Fong had said. They came back. Aang squeezed his eyes shut. He knew what the general had been trying to do. That was the reason they were still at the base, after all. Because Aang could not quite forget General Fong's parting words. People are dying, Aang. You could end it, now. Think about it. He sighed and stared out over the balcony, looking down at the group of wounded soldiers. It was easy to walk away when it was just a blustering general telling him that he needed to defeat the Fire Lord. It was not so easy when he was confronted with a courtyard of pain-tinged expressions and disfigured bodies. Avatar Roku had told him that he needed to master the elements before going against Oze, except Aang only had until summer's end before the comet arrived, and every day the Fire Nation was taking more lives. There isn't enough time, Aang muttered, tightening his grip on the balcony so that his knuckles burned white. He had no guarantee that he would be able to master the elements before the comet arrived, but he did know the full extent of the power he could gain through entering the avatar state. The only problem was that he didn't know if learning how to enter the avatar state was the right thing to do either. The nightmares had continued to plague him and he had by no means forgotten his conversation with Zuko. It was cruel and wrong. If that's your method of keeping the balance, Avatar, then I want nothing to do with you. Aang hung his head, conscious of a sharp twisting in his gut. No matter what he did, people were going to die. He wished he knew what was right. He wished he had someone to advise him, yet all he felt in that moment was the unbearable weight of General Feng's hand still pressing down on his shoulder. Oh! The storm set in swiftly. Zuko would have cursed the spirits for his bad luck, but in truth he wasn't all that surprised. 3 years ago today he had lost everything when his father had banished him. Now he was celebrating the anniversary by struggling for his life on a worn-out raft surrounded by heaving waters. In despair, he watched the remains of his supplies get swept overboard and then disappear into the black depths. In despair, he saw the mast break and the cloth sail whip away in the wind. He tried to cling to the paddle for as long as possible, but he was having a difficult time just trying to keep himself on the raft. A wave crashed over him, dragging and sucking him towards the water like a gaping maw. The paddle was nowhere to be seen. He cursed and tightened his hold on the wood. Splinters pierced his hands, but he was too charged with adrenaline to notice the pain. Then another wave pummeled into him and he found himself choking on a mouthful of salty water as he was forced to release his grip. Though a strong swimmer, Zuko was helpless in that moment. Down and down he went, pushed deeper by the gravity of the waves while the ocean tugged him in every direction as if trying to tear him apart. Fear seized hold of his chest as he realized he had no idea in which direction he should go to find the surface, and he knew with grim certainty that he needed to get to the surface. The burning in his lungs and the painful urge to vomit told him that he had swallowed too much water. He was already beginning to feel sluggish and dizzy. I'm going to drown. The thought flashed in his mind, but instead of accepting his defeat, he forced himself into motion, praying with all of his heart that he was heading in the right direction. The current still pushed and pulled, but at last he managed to break through the surface. He coughed and spat out the water that had got into his lungs, even as he took in great gulps of air. A quick scan of his surroundings revealed that his raft was now several meters away. Inwardly he groaned, but he knew he would not be able to survive the storm unless he could hold on to something that floated. He was just about to start swimming in earnest when a fresh wave smashed into his back, pushing him back under the water. Zuko managed to keep his mouth shut this time, but he was still gasping for air when he finally got back to the surface. To his horror, he realized he was now even farther from the raft. No! The scream ripped free from his throat, angry and bitter, and so terribly afraid. He did not want to die. He had gone through too much to die now. But the ocean was determined to keep him, and no matter how determinedly he tried to reach the raft, his fingers never did find purchase. Water encased his body. It slipped inside his mouth and nostrils to choke his breath, it stung his eyes and turned his vision into a haze of liquid black. He was losing consciousness, but then arms wrapped around his body, pulling him upwards. Don't worry, Prince Zuko, a gruff voice said in his ear. I've got you. Zuko blinked dazedly and saw a blur of red. Then his eyes rolled back into his head and even the storm ceased to matter. Oh! Someone was stroking his face. Zuko could feel the soft fingers skimming along his forehead, then brushing down across his unscarred cheek in a caress that just allowed the person's little finger to trace the curve of his jaw. It was a gentle touch, should have been a soothing touch, but his chest tightened and his muscles tensed. Long, sharpened fingernails grazed his skin as the person stroked his face again. He breathed in sharply and opened his eyes. A young girl stared back at him, her dark hair pulled up into a topknot with a red headpiece holding it in place. Hello, brother, she greeted, allowing a smile to form on her lips. Zuko wrenched his face away from her hand. Angela. What are you doing here? She made a sound of disapproval. In my country, we exchange a pleasant hello before asking questions. Have you become uncivilized so soon, Zuzu? Don't call me that. Her eyes gleamed. Zuko ignored her and tried to sit up on the bed, only to sway as a rush of dizziness washed over him. He placed his hand against the wall to keep himself upright, taking in deep, steadying breaths. Spirits, he felt so weak. He wasn't even sure how he had got out of the storm, but one look around the room told him that he was in some kind of steel cabin, which meant he had to be on a Fire Nation ship. "How did I get here?" he asked. "What happened?" "My guards went fishing. They found you half dead in the ocean. You're lucky I was around. You would have drowned if my helmsman hadn't seen you." Zuko's eyes narrowed a fraction. "You still haven't told me why you're here." Azula sighed. "Well, since you're so intent to get to the point. I actually came to find you." "Me? You and Uncle, but yes. I've come with a message from home." Father's changed his mind. Family is suddenly very important to him. He's heard rumors of plans to overthrow him, treacherous plots. Family are the only ones you can really trust. Her voice softened, as did her expression. "Father regrets your banishment, Zuko. He wants you home." For a moment Zuko was too stunned to say anything. His emotions whirled inside of him, too fast for him to understand what it was exactly that he felt. Hope, fear, relief, uncertainty. They were all there, tangling in a confused mesh of feelings, yet all he could think over and over were those simple words: his father wanted him home. His father wanted him home. "Did you hear me?" Azula demanded. "You should be happy. Excited. Grateful. I just gave you great news." Zuko met his sister's gaze. "Father regrets?" he asked in a voice that sounded too small and vulnerable to be his own. He wants me back. Isn't that what I just told you?" "Really, Zuko, how much seawater did you swallow?" He shook his head, looking the other way. It's been 3 years. 3 years of silence. 3 years of wondering if he would ever be able to prove himself worthy of his father's respect." He raised a hand to his scar, feeling the rough, uneven flesh. How he had ached to hear those words, to be told that he could finally go home. He had thought it would only happen once he had captured the Avatar, but there were no stipulations this time. No impossible tasks. His father regretted his banishment. His father cared. It almost seemed too good to be true. Azula stood up from the bed. "I can see you need time to take this in. If you need anything, call for one of the guards. I'd recommend a bath and a change of clothes." She eyed his borrowed attire with distaste. "Those water tribrags you're wearing are not fit for the crown prince of the Fire Nation." He watched her turn to leave. "Wait." She glanced back at him with her eyebrow raised. "You mentioned Uncle," Zuko said, conscious of the way his heart pounded in his chest. "Do you know where he is?" Azula's expression hardened. "Uncle Iroh will not be coming home with us." "You've seen him?" She nodded. "This morning, in fact. At the Yinghua bathhouse." "Then why?" "It seems that Uncle does not share our feeling for family unity." Her lips curved. "But I'm sure he'll come around with the right persuasion." A crease formed on Zuko's brow. He couldn't imagine his uncle walking away from a chance to return to the Fire Nation. Not after everything that had happened, and especially not if he knew that Zuko's banishment had been lifted. It didn't make sense yet. "Don't look so troubled, Zuzu," she said, interrupting his thoughts. "I'm sure that once Uncle realizes you're safe in the palace, he'll come back home." "I guess," he said slowly. She allowed her smile to widen. "Well, I'll leave you to get some rest. Don't forget to call for the guards if you need anything." He nodded absently, too tired and too distracted by everything he had heard to pay attention to her parting words. It wasn't until the door had closed behind her that he realized what had felt so wrong about the conversation. Azula had been pleasant. Too pleasant. Azula always lies. The thought flickered in his mind, but he banished it immediately. There was no reason for his sister to lie about something like this. No reason at all. He was just being paranoid. He was just tense from being stuck on a raft for almost 3 weeks and nearly drowning. He should be grateful that she had saved him. He was grateful that she had saved him. But he still felt uneasy. Zuko sighed and placed his head in his hands, running his fingers along the short strands of hair that had grown back while he had been stuck in prison and traveling on the raft. He'd have to shave that off eventually, but not right now. His sister had given him much to think about, and he was just too exhausted and on edge to care about something as mundane as his appearance. Though a bath did sound nice. In fact, the thought of getting out of his dirty, salt-encrusted clothes and soaking in a tub of hot water sounded really, really nice. I suppose there's no harm in relaxing a little, he mused. He could worry about why his uncle had chosen not to return with them to the Fire Nation later. For now, he'd just try to make the most of his new accommodations. There were some things that even Zuko could not resist. After 3 weeks of not being able to wash, a hot bath was definitely one of them. Oh. A firm knock on the door startled Zuko awake. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes and wondering how long he'd been out. After bathing and changing into the grey jinbei one of the firebenders had brought for him, he'd ended up face-planting his pillow and falling asleep in seconds. His bones still ached with tiredness. It would probably be a while before he recovered from everything that had happened. Unfortunately, whoever was knocking on the other side of the door was persistent. "What is it?" Zuko asked, smothering a yawn with his hand. "Princess Azula has requested you join her for dinner." He raised his eyebrow. Even if the man used the word request, it was obviously an order. Azula was still as demanding as ever. Zuko didn't have the energy to fight his sister just then, and a part of him had to admit that he was curious. They'd had no contact since his banishment. He wanted to ask her about home. He wanted to know if she had changed at all. Plus, he was just damn hungry. He slid his feet into the slippers he'd been given and opened the door. The same firebender who'd attended on him earlier greeted him, the tall, beefy man with the wonky nose. Zuko's brow creased. Was this guy meant to be his personal helper now or something? "What's your name again?" Zuko asked. The man blinked. Shu. Shu. Okay. Shu looked a bit at a loss. Perhaps Azula had never asked for his name before. He straightened a second later and his expression became as lively as a plank of wood. "You should hurry, Prince Zuko," he advised. "Princess Azula does not like to be kept waiting." Zuko repressed a sigh. It seemed his sister was still terrorizing everyone with her impatience. Then again, he probably hadn't been much better while hunting the Avatar. "I'm ready," he said. "Lead the way." They headed down the corridor, passing circular windows that looked out onto the deck. Zuko realized very quickly that his sister's ship was huge. His own, now a mess of rubble thanks to Zhao and the pirates, would have been like a baby's toy in comparison. Old jealousy stirred in the pit of his stomach. Typical of father's favorite to get the nice boat. There wasn't even a speck of rust. He bet her crew didn't demand music nights or get drunk on the job either. Forget it, Zuko told himself. It had always been this way. Besides, what mattered was that father was letting him go back home. Azula could have all the fancy ships she wanted for all it mattered now. They stopped outside a big, metal door. Shu knocked twice. He waited for Azula to grant them entrance before opening it and gesturing for Zuko to go inside. Zuko blinked a little as he crossed the threshold. The cabin was large and well-furnished, not the bare requirements, that was for sure. There was an ornate cabinet and desk, a luxurious rug, and even the massive bed was adorned with red, silk hangings. Personally, Zuko thought it was a bit over the top. He'd just slept on a plain mattress on his ship and his furniture could have only been described as serviceable. Then again, this was his sister. Azula had always liked to pamper herself. He remembered she'd been forever getting her nails and hair done back at the palace. His gaze shifted to her. She sat at a low table that had been set for two. Fish, rice, and vegetables were laid out on top. His mouth watered. Never mind the furnishings, the smell of their dinner was tantalizing. How long had it been since he'd had proper food? "Leave us," Azula ordered, not taking her eyes off her brother. Shu and a female servant, who had been standing quietly in the corner, bowed and left the room. The door was shut so brother and sister could have some privacy. Zuko got the impression that Azula wanted him to ask her for permission to sit. He refused to do that. Instead, he walked confidently to the table and sat down on the cushion opposite her. Angela's eyes gleamed a little. "You look better now that you're not wearing those rags," she observed. "Pity about the scar. It's really quite ugly, isn't it?" He had to resist the urge to ball his hands into fists. "I guess. I don't think about it much." It was difficult to keep his tone flat. Still, if he let show that she had struck a nerve, she'd just dig her claws in deeper. That was her way. Besides, he knew she'd only made the comment because he'd refused to play her game. Angela didn't like it when people ruined her fun. "I think you've changed," she said, eyeing him with a suddenly sharp gaze. "You haven't at all." They stared at each other for a tense moment. Then her lips curved upwards. "Come, brother, let's not fight tonight. We've finally been reunited after all these years." Her smile widened and she extended her hand to him. "Haven't you missed me even a little?" Zuko let out a breath. "Are you saying you've missed me?" "Of course." She placed her hand on his. "We're family, aren't we?" His shoulders relaxed a fraction. Maybe his sister had changed in some ways. "Right," he agreed. "Family." She released his hand and encouraged him to start eating. Zuko didn't need telling twice. He made quick work of his fish before setting into his rice and vegetables. The food tasted as good as it smelled, succulent and fresh. He definitely appreciated being rescued now. Since Angela was also smart enough not to bring up any sensitive topics again, not to mention could be very charming when she wanted, dinner passed more pleasantly than he'd anticipated. They talked about home and all their old acquaintances. He was a bit shocked to learn that Ty Lee had run away to join a traveling circus and that Maya was living in a newly conquered area of the Earth Kingdom. "It's just been me for a while now," Angela said, flicking a few grains of rice over in her bowl with her chopsticks. "Not that I'm repining. Friends can be such a distraction and I've been busy with training." "Oh." She rested her chin on her hand. "How is your bending coming along?" Zuko's cheeks heated. He hadn't even mastered the basics. "Fine, I guess," he mumbled, looking the other way. Angela stared at him with far too shrewd eyes. At any other time, she would have pounced on the lie and made him fess up the truth. Then she would have mocked him mercilessly until he felt no better than an insect stuck underneath her boot. But tonight she was trying to be a good sister. "Well, keep at it," she said in an even tone. "Practice makes perfect." His eyes widened a fraction. The comment went against everything he would have expected from her. She had been so brutal in the past. "You'll never catch up." Zuko lowered his gaze. "Right." They continued to talk about inconsequential things. When she smiled and later wished him good night, he found that he had no reason not to smile in return or to hope that she slept well. Still, something just niggled. It wasn't just because she had been nice during dinner, and he frankly wasn't used to that. It was something about this whole situation. If Angela wasn't lying, why hadn't their uncle joined her? What had made Iroh stay away? The thought wouldn't stop nagging. He was still mulling over the matter when he walked back to his own cabin. Shu shadowed his footsteps, having come to collect him from Angela's room. Never mind that Zuko could remember the way just fine. It was like his sister was worried he would go wandering off or something. "I don't need you to keep hanging around," Zuko said once they reached his room. "I'm just going to sleep." He closed the door without another word, though some instinct made him pause and listen. No retreating footsteps sounded from the other side. Either Shu walked like an airbender or he was still standing outside the door. Zuko let out a breath. Certainly, it could not be said that this was a damning piece of evidence. It just didn't sit right with him either. Like the fact his uncle had not come, like the fact Angela had been so pleasant when her sadistic urge to poke at his sensitive spots was still there. He needed to know the truth. The question was how to get that when his sister had a habit of lying and everyone on the ship was her subordinate. His mouth twisted. It seemed he had his work cut out for him. Oh. Aang woke with a lurching sensation and his heart pounding. Darkness greeted his eyes. Sokka was snoring from his left, reminding him where he was and that it had been a long time since he had last seen Zuko, let alone fought him on a ship. Slowly, his muscles began to relax. It was just a dream. Only a dream. But it had seemed so real. He placed his hands over his face, trying to block out the images. In his mind, however, he could still see the white glow that had illuminated his arrows as he turned to confront Zuko, still see the fear that entered those gold eyes as he slashed forward to strike. Aang shivered and hugged his knees to his chest. He didn't want to think about what had happened next, because in his dream he hadn't been aiming to hurt Zuko. He had been aiming to kill. Just don't think about it, he told himself. It was a dream. It didn't mean anything. But the images would not leave him. The longer he sat there, the more disturbed he felt. In all of his other nightmares he had been the one to be attacked by his glowing self. This was the first time someone else had taken his place, and it troubled him that his subconscious should have chosen Zuko. Perhaps it was because he had been thinking about him earlier that day, or maybe it was because he had felt a twinge of those awful feelings again, the ones that told him that Zuko's life was in danger. Somehow, though, Aang thought it was more than that. I saw the bodies. I saw the ships. No Water Tribe army could have done that, but you most definitely could. Aang squeezed his eyes shut. Zuko had been the one who had first made him realize the true significance of what the victory at the North Pole had meant. Zuko's words had been harsh and hurtful, but they had opened Aang's eyes to a glimpse of the truth. A truth he now knew that he could no longer deny. The white rage of the Avatar state had filled him with grim determination during the siege of the North, a blinding need to defend and attack, but it had also controlled him into creating a floating graveyard. It had made him kill. There was nothing that could change that, no matter how strongly Aang knew in his heart that he had never intended to take a life. Now, after reliving those attacks from the point of view of his victims, Aang knew that Zuko had been right. He should have never gone into the Avatar state, no matter how upset he had been. The monks had always told him that those with great power also had a responsibility to control that power, but Aang had allowed the Avatar state to control him. He had been as wild as Admiral Zhao's fireballs, tearing destruction through the Fire Nation navy with careless ease. Like a monster, he whispered, echoing Zuko's words. It was a crushing realization. What sickened Aang most was that even after the battle, he had not considered that he had been attacking individual soldiers. He had just seen Fire Nation, a faceless enemy that needed to be stopped. Even Zuko screaming at him about all the men and women who had died had not really allowed the truth to sink in. It was only after Aang had seen himself kill Zuko in his dream that he realized the Fire Nation was more than just nameless figures in red and black armor. After all, Zuko was Fire Nation too, and he did have a face, one that was scarred and fierce, but could bleed and bruise just like anyone else's. Aang buried his face into his knees. There was no saying what he should have done at the North Pole. The Fire Nation navy had needed to be stopped, of that there was no denying, but maybe there had been a better way that he could have gone about things. Still, it was too late now. The past was the past. All he could do was try to shape the future, and in that he knew he could not help General Fong invade the Fire Nation. People were dying, but they were dying on both sides. Aang wasn't about to add to that number if he could help it. Oh. The next morning, Aang made his way to General Fong's room. He spotted him standing by the window, looking down into the courtyard where Aang knew the injured soldiers would be gathering to be healed. Something clenched in his stomach, but he ignored the feeling. He had made up his mind. General Fong, Aang said, taking a few steps into the room. The general turned and welcomed Aang with a warm smile. Come in, Aang. Have you thought about our discussion? Aang stared at his feet. I have, and I've realized that Katara is right. At this point, I just need to focus on mastering the 4 elements. I would have thought, being the Avatar, that you would understand the importance of ending this war quickly. Or do you not care that hundreds of people are dying every day? I do care, Aang said softly. That's why I can't go through with your plan. He raised his head, meeting his gaze with grave determination. I won't be your weapon, General Fong. I won't kill for you or for anyone else. As the Avatar, it's my duty to keep balance in the world. To do that I have to master the 4 elements and then defeat the Fire Lord. That is my destiny, and that is what I will do. You're making a mistake, Avatar. Aang shook his head. No. For once, I'm doing the right thing. General Feng's mouth twisted into what might have been a frown but which looked more like a snarl. He said a lot of things after that cruel, wounding things that were designed to make Aang feel guilty and as if he was abandoning the Earth Kingdom, even the world, to be slaughtered by the Fire Nation. It was all emotional blackmail, of course, and maybe once Aang would have been moved by the accusations, but in that moment he just felt sad. Sad and tired. I'm sorry, General, Aang said, bowing low to him in the fashion of the air nomads. Nothing you say will change my mind. Aang turned on his heel and left the room. The sound of rock smashing echoed in his ears, but he just quickened his pace, knowing there was nothing he could do. It didn't take him long to find Sokka and Katara. You alright? Sokka asked, noticing his expression. You don't look so good. We need to leave, Aang said, already moving to pack his things. Sokka scratched his chin. What about that escort we were supposed to be getting to take us to Omashu? Wasn't that crazy general supposed to? That's why we need to leave. I told General Feng that I'm not going to help him invade the Fire Nation. He, wasn't exactly happy about it. Right, Sokka said, catching on. So we can probably forget the escort, then. Aang smiled sheepishly. Pretty much. Well, I'm glad we're leaving, Katara said, folding her arms across her chest. I didn't like that General Feng guy one bit, and I think we're better off without any escort he could have given us. Momo landed on Aang's shoulder and chirruped loudly. Aang smiled and scratched the lemur behind the ears. I think Momo agrees with you. Wait a minute. Sokka exclaimed, looking from one to the next with dawning realization. Does this mean we're going to miss breakfast? Aang blinked. I guess. Sokka sighed and clutched at his grumbling belly. Sorry, stomach. Looks like it's going to be nuts again. Katara rolled her eyes. You'll survive, I'm sure. Aang flashed a smile at him. Come on, Sokka. Just think of the feast Bumi will give us once we get to Omashu. That did cheer Sokka up, but as they packed the rest of their belongings and then flew away on Appa, it was with a heavy heart that Aang watched the Earth Kingdom base fade from view. He knew he had made the right choice, but that didn't make living with his decision any easier. For the sake of the world, even the Fire Nation, he hoped that he would be able to master the elements soon. Oh. Zuko had known at some point he would have to search his sister's cabin. Something about being on this ship made him on edge, like a wind-up toy waiting to be released. Azula's answers to his questions were not satisfying. The fact he was being watched all the time grated. He'd found himself thinking back on their first conversation, remembering the way her expression had hardened when he'd asked about his uncle, remembering her sharp little smiles and gleaming eyes, the discordant notes in her smooth masterpiece. That was the Azula he knew, the sister who would play sweet just before she struck. Except this time there had been no strike. So Zuko had slipped away from his guard and snuck into her cabin when he knew her to be busy on deck. A part of him hadn't even expected to find much. He couldn't think of a good reason for her to lie, not about his banishment, but then he had found the posters. The color drained from his cheeks as he looked at a hand-drawn image of his own face, scarred, far too recognizable, and with a bounty listed for his capture on the right. On the lower half of the poster was an equally recognizable drawing of his uncle. Both of them had been listed as traitors. Zuko's hands trembled. Are you saying you've missed me? Of course. We're family, aren't we? His throat constricted and the trembling in his hands got worse. Rage and hurt splintered through him, but it was rage that won. Azula, he growled, crushing the poster in his fist. He stormed out of the cabin, pushing past anyone who got in his path as he made his way back to the deck where he had last seen his sister. She was giving some orders to her men, but he simply shoved them aside. You lied to me? He shouted. Azula rolled her eyes as if he were nothing more than a small child throwing a tantrum. What are you talking about? He thrust the poster in her face. I see. A smile curved her lips. Well, I guess you found me out. An inhuman snarl escaped his throat. Fire streamed from his hands and crafted into twin daggers, burning right through the poster. Suddenly, he lunged for his sister, slashing wildly at her face, anything to wipe the smile off her mouth and ease the gnawing ache of betrayal in his chest. She dodged his blows again and again, not once bothering to retaliate with an attack of her own. It was an insult to his bending and they both knew it. His eyes narrowed and he struck out with a ferocious slice to her left, hoping to catch her off guard. Angela caught his wrist and spun him around, twisting his arm up against his back and pulling him hard to her chest. Zuko froze, breathing heavily as he found himself trapped. "You know, Father blames Uncle for the loss at the North Pole," she hissed into his ear, "and he considers you a miserable failure for not finding the Avatar." Her voice dug into him like knives. "Why would he want you back home except to lock you up where you can no longer embarrass him?" Zuko screamed in anger and lashed out with his free hand, forcing her to release her hold. He followed quickly with a flaming hook kick. The fire licked a little too close to her skin. She straightened from her crouch and her lips twisted into an ugly expression. The next second he was stumbling backwards, blood dripping down his forehead where her nails had snagged, an inverted echo of the caress she had given him when he'd first woken on her ship. For a moment they just glared at each other. Then the fire daggers were back in his hands and he lunged for her again, determined to make her feel his pain, determined to make her see how much she liked it when her family turned on her. "Come on, brother." Angela laughed as she slipped away from his attacks with agile ease. "You're going to have to do better than that." He responded by bringing both daggers around in a ruthless strike to her chest. Angela sidestepped and kicked him hard in the stomach, sending him sprawling in a heap of bruised limbs to the ground. Smoke curled free of his mouth. With a strangled yell, he charged for her again, flames trailing from his hands. Her lips curved. She raised her hand and then all he saw was blue fire. It was so hot, so fast. Zuko didn't have time to think. He bent back as far as his spine would allow and managed to avoid the fireball. The moment he straightened, a wave of heat mixed with pure elemental force struck him in his stomach. All the air whooshed from him. He hit the ship railing, still struggling to breathe and blinking away fuzzy spots from his eyes. "Oh, did that hurt?" she taunted. Dazedly, he tried to regain his balance. The difference in their skill was humiliating clear, but even then he couldn't give up. He just couldn't. Angela stepped into his line of vision. He saw that same sharp little smile lift the corners of her mouth. She poised the fingers of her right hand like a blade and moved her arms in a circular motion, blue streaks crackling and arcing around her. Zuko's heart gave an odd lurch in his chest. Then she pointed her fingers at him. Lightning surged free, moving in a flash of sapphire for his heart. No. It was a scream in his mind. He desperately tried to throw himself out of the way, but his limbs were still shaky from her last attack. That was when the lightning struck. It collided with his shoulder in an explosion of agony, sending shockwaves of white-hot energy throughout his body. He cried out from the intensity. It felt like an electrified fist had closed around his heart, squeezing tightly and slowing the life-giving beat right down. Dimly, he realized that he was falling not to the ground, but over the railing and towards the ocean. The last thing he remembered was the feeling of flames swallowing him whole. Oh! Angela stared at the space where her brother had stood only moments ago. One of the guards who had watched the fight stepped forward. "Princess Angela, would you like us to begin a search?" Prince Zuko can't have got too far after, well. He trailed off and cast her a nervous glance. Angela's eyes hardened as his unspoken words whispered between them, because she had hit Zuko with the most lethal of fire-bending techniques. "Don't bother," she said, turning to face the man. "Even if my brother managed to survive the lightning, he'd be little more than a corpse now." The guard bowed and fell back into line with the others. Angela shifted her gaze to the expanse of storm-tossed blue. A faint crease formed on her brow. Once, she had seen cuts that bled in rivulets of red disappear from her brother's body right before her eyes. She had seen bruises fade and watched him recover from injuries that should have paralyzed any other child, even killed. But she knew there could be no miracle recovery this time. Whatever the strangeness of her brother's inner fire, the lightning had struck true. If that didn't stop his heart, the ocean was sure to finish the job. Her jaw clenched. "Send a message to my father," she ordered the guard. "What should I tell him?" Angela met his gaze coolly. "Tell him that Prince Zuko is dead." Chapter 2, A Life in Fragments. The sun was just beginning to set when Aang decided it was time to call it a day and find a place to camp. They were all hungry and tired, and he was reluctant to push Appa any further with Omashu still so far away. A brief squabble ensued upon landing about who would do what chore, but eventually it was decided that Aang and Momo would collect the firewood, Katara would put up the tent, and Sokka would gather food for their evening meal. Appa, having done his duty, sprawled on the ground and closed his eyes. "Get some rest, boy," Aang said, patting his head. Appa gave a content rumble and rolled onto his back, clearly asking for a belly scratch. Laughing, Aang performed this service and then headed off into the trees. Momo darted ahead in a streak of white fur. After everything that had happened, Aang found it comforting to meander through the woods, just listening to the rustling leaves and the occasional bird calling to its friends. It was the kind of tranquility one could only find when at peace with nature, and he had missed that. Of course, the stillness was soon disturbed as Momo discovered a particularly juicy bug and started chirruping excitedly. "We're looking for firewood, Momo." "Not bugs," Aang scolded, though the amusement in his eyes belied his chiding tone. Momo held up the half-bitten bug in offering, as if to say that Aang could have some too. "No, thanks." Aang scrunched his face. "I think I'll just stick with whatever vegetarian-friendly food Sokka manages to find." He rubbed his gurgling stomach. Hopefully, it would be more than a collection of nut-shaped rocks. Momo finished the last of his snack and scuttled ahead to pick up the smaller pieces of wood littering the forest floor so that they could start the fire. Aang focused on gathering the larger branches. Between the two of them, it didn't take long to collect a decent stack of firewood, though it was true the lemur seemed more interested in the bugs he found underneath the fallen bits of timber. "I think this should be enough," Aang said, clutching the stack to his chest. "Let's head back." Momo chirrupied and took off into the air with his own bundle. Aang had only taken a few steps when pain surged through his chest, squeezing at his vital organs and filling him with a deadly coldness. Gasping, he collapsed to his knees and barely noticed the firewood tumbling from his slackened hold. Everything felt as if it were twisting and writhing inside of him, making him dizzy and his throat burn with the taste of rising bile. However, it was the numbing emptiness spreading through him that frightened him most. The buried warmth he had come to see as a part of himself was slipping away, like frayed threads unraveling with the slightest tug. He closed his eyes, curling into himself as if he could somehow keep the warmth locked inside his body. It didn't help. A concerned chirrup told him that Momo was beside him. He felt a small paw touch his arm. Aang just breathed in and out, not even caring that dirt was getting into his mouth from where he had pressed his face against the ground. It hurt so much, but the pain was more than physical. It reached deep into his spirit, into his very soul. He clutched his arms tighter around his stomach, feeling the sting of unshed tears burn his eyes. "Zuko," he managed to choke out in a whisper. "What's happening to you?" There was no one to give him an answer, but Aang knew in his heart that something had gone wrong. Whatever had happened, it was bad. Really bad. The strain on their bond had never felt as intense as this before, never so crippling. Momo squeaked in distress and tugged at Aang's cape, trying to pull him back to his feet. When this failed, Momo took off into the air and flew back towards camp, no doubt to get help. Not that Aang noticed. He was desperately trying to keep those fiery threads from escaping his grasp, desperately trying to stop that invisible hand from reaching any further inside of him to snatch away the link. Somehow, he knew that Zuko would die if that happened. "Come on, Zuko," Aang inwardly pleaded, clutching a hand to his aching heart. "You have to fight this. I don't know what's happened, but you can't just give up. Please. Please, keep fighting." For a moment he almost thought he caught a glimpse of the other boy, a whisper of water, lightning, and pain. Then the images faded and Aang was back on the forest floor, curled up on the dirt as his body trembled from the effects of their fragmenting bond. He was still pleading for Zuko not to give up when the agony became too much and he slipped into unconsciousness. Oh. Pain. That was the only thing that existed in that moment. Pain and fire. Zuko knew that he should be dead. He'd fallen. Fallen so very far, even as his body convulsed with the shocks of energy ripping through his limbs and vital organs. For a moment his heartbeat had stopped, but then the flames had burst free from deep inside of him, spreading through his chi paths, and somehow he had continued to breathe. Somehow, his heart had found a new rhythm, one that was fragile and small, but still pulsed with life. Now, with no energy to move, he just floated, cradled by the watery hands of the ocean as he struggled to stay conscious. To stay alive. He didn't know how long it had been since he had lost sight of Agela's ship, but he was just beginning to sink again when his hand made contact with something hard. Instinct made him wrap his fingers around the obstruction, feeling the rough texture of wood that had been doused with wave after wave, yet had still somehow managed to stay roped together. My raft. The thought was like a sigh of relief in his mind. With an effort, he opened his eyes and blinked past the splashes of orange painting the sky to look at what was left of his boat. There was a jagged piece of timber sticking up from the middle where the mast had snapped, but otherwise it was mostly intact. Either way, the floating bits of wood would stop him from drowning. Gritting his teeth, Zuko slowly dragged himself up onto the raft, conscious of each painful motion that it took to get his body out of the water. Black dots swarmed his vision, almost blinding him with a rush of nausea. There was a high-pitched ringing in his ears. He suddenly found himself on all fours and vomiting as the full force of his efforts struck home. It was too much. All of this was too much. Acid choked and burned his throat, but at last the heaving stopped and Zuko collapsed onto his side, not even caring that there was vomit stuck to his cheek or that his face was just inches from the rest of the foul-smelling pool. Breathe, he told himself. Just breathe. So he did, in and out, just like when he meditated. Slowly, his shaking limbs began to calm, though his heart continued to flutter in his chest like the broken wings of a sparrowkeet. Too exhausted to do anything more, Zuko rolled onto his back and closed his eyes, feeling the fire rippling through his veins ignite with renewed power. It seemed like hours that he drifted along with the current, helpless, and just barely clinging to life. Sometimes, he wished it would end, that the water surrounding him would turn violent as it had the night before and drag him down to oblivion. At least then he wouldn't have to deal with the pain. At least then he would be able to forget. You know, Father blames Uncle for the loss at the North Pole, and he considers you a miserable failure for not finding the Avatar. Why would he want you back home except to lock you up where you can no longer embarrass him? Zuko shied away from the memory, inadvertently reaching for the flames that were spinning tendrils of heat around his consciousness. Somehow, he sensed that Agela and her lies couldn't exist in the inferno, that fear and anguish were just words with no real significance when compared to the golden flickers of his inner fire. Yet the ache he felt because of his sister's betrayal still festered under his skin like a cyst waiting to burst. Even the physical effect of his injuries was nothing compared to that soul-crushing pain. Too much, a small voice repeated in his mind. Yes, it was too much. Too much on what had already seemed like too much for him to endure. His spirit and mind felt so battered and bruised, like it was willpower alone that was holding the fraying pieces of his identity together. By the time the raft came to a halt, banking itself on an unfamiliar shore, there was only one clear thought in his mind: he had to get away. He had to survive. With trembling fingers, Zuko removed the dagger from his boot, grabbed the longer strands of hair he always kept pulled back, and sliced through the lot. The black strands fell into the water, glowing with the silver hues of the moon before being carried away with the tide. His hands were still shaking as he sheathed the blade. Then he set about removing every scrap of clothing from his body that could pinpoint him as Fire Nation. Soon, he was just wearing the gray pants and matching tunic that served as an underlay for most fire-bending armor. He would have liked to have kept the boots, but together the combination was too obviously Fire Nation. His chest tightened as the significance of what he was doing struck him anew. I have to let it go. Forcing the panicked voices battering against the walls of his mind into silence, he exhaled deeply and summoned a ball of fire to his hand. The flame was paler than usual and the effort to maintain the flow of energy seemed to wrench a new hole of pain inside him, but he still managed to burn through the pile of clothes until there was nothing left but ashes and the smell of singed material. Now it was done, but he felt no relief upon realizing that the last of his outward ties to his home had been severed. Instead, his hands trembled even more violently and he had to close his eyes as his stomach twisted into knots. He wanted to vomit again. Too much, that voice echoed in his mind. Suddenly he was falling, collapsing face first on the ground as his limbs gave out from sheer exhaustion. It had probably not been a good idea to use his bending when he was still so damaged and weak, yet he could feel the fire continuing to burn in a tiny sun at the center of his being, whispering of healing and comfort. His heart gave another uneven flutter in his chest. Zuko didn't pause to think, he just drove his consciousness deeper into the wall of flames, sensing that it was the only way to keep the fragile beat alive. Down and down he went, feeling the inferno strip away all in its blazing heat until he reached the spark that thrummed with life at the core of his being. He pressed himself close to its warmth, letting it wrap around him in a fiery web until there was no separating the boy from the flames. Until he could feel the memories and pain slipping away to become no more than specks of dust on his canvas of thought. He wasn't sure how long he lay there cradled in his cocoon of fire. Sometimes it felt like days, other times it felt like only seconds had passed. Eventually, though, he realized that he had to keep moving. There were hazy images flickering in his mind, flashes of people and places he knew he should recognize, but it all seemed such a blur. The only thing he knew for certain was the fear urging him forward, the need to put as much distance between himself and whatever it was that he had left behind. Curling his fingers into the sand, he pushed himself back to his feet and stuffed the dagger into his tunic, along with the Paisho tile and waterlogged scrap of parchment. His heart fluttered sickeningly in his chest, and he could still feel the fire simmering under his skin, but somehow he managed to half stumble, half crawl his way from the shore towards the nearby forest. It was a slow process, and more than once he fell, gasping, and gritting his teeth against the shocks of agony that lingered in his body. A part of him just wanted to give up and surrender to the flames, which even now whispered for him to sink back into their calming warmth, but he knew that he could not stop. The fire might soothe his pain, but it could not protect him forever. It could not hold back the nightmare that haunted his scattered thoughts. Keep moving, he told himself ruthlessly. Like a blind thing he crawled, no longer able to find the energy to stand. The wound on his shoulder throbbed in ways he couldn't comprehend from the added pressure. He thought he might have fainted at some point, but somehow he managed to keep going. It was a relief when he felt the texture of the ground change to leaf-scattered dirt, telling him that he had at least got away from the shore. However, it was not long before even the sheer force of his will was not enough to keep his limbs in motion. Breathing heavily, he collapsed on his back and stared up at the sky. Slivers of silver slipped through the canopy of trees. He didn't know if he would be safe in the forest. All he knew was that he could not move another inch. He had finally reached his limit. He closed his eyes and prayed with all of his heart that he would wake when the sun touched the heavens. If nothing else could be done, then at least let him wake. At least let him live. I refuse to die like this. It was his last thought. The flames were already reaching for him again, lulling him into unconsciousness while threads of fire worked their way through his chi paths. As the darkness closed in on his mind, somewhere out on the ocean a scattering of ash and black hair floated away into the night. Oh. Several hours had passed since Momo had first rushed back to camp, flying in circles above Katara's head and chittering loudly. Even now, she could still remember the fear that had seized her heart when she had followed him into the trees and discovered Aang's crumpled form, a fear that had only increased once it became clear that whatever it was that was keeping Aang unconscious, the sickness was beyond her curative abilities. Helpless and afraid, she had called for her brother and together they had carried Aang back to camp and settled him down on the blankets inside the tent. She had been so scared while she had sat beside him, just hoping that he would recover. She had never thought that she would be more worried when he awoke. "Aang, you can't do this!" Sokka exclaimed, blocking his path. "I know you're upset, but just think about what you're trying to do. I can't just sit around and do nothing." Aang shouted, clenching his hands into fists. "We're already part of the way to Omashu. If you leave now..." "I could feel him dying, Sokka. Do you have any idea what that was like for me? I could feel him dying and there was nothing I could do." Aang bit his lip and his hands trembled slightly. "I don't even know if the bond is still intact. He could be dead and I wouldn't even." Katara stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. "It's okay, Aang," she said, holding him close. "It's okay." Aang looked up at her with overly bright eyes. "You understand, right?" She averted her face. "I do understand." I understand that you're scared and worried and want to know that the blue spirit is alright. She took in a breath, hesitating a moment. But I also know that Sokka is right. Aang broke free of her embrace. How can you say that? The Earth Kingdom is huge. She gave a helpless shrug. I'm sorry, Aang, but even if you did sense that the blue spirit is near water, there's no saying that you would be able to find him. It could take days, weeks, even. Are you willing to risk that? But Sokka placed a hand on his shoulder. I know it seems harsh, but we just don't have the time to go running around the Earth Kingdom in search of one guy. Maybe the blue spirit is hurt, but so are a lot of other people. I think it would be better if you just continued on to Omasha like we planned so you can learn earthbending. Aang faced the other way, dislodging Sokka's grip. You don't understand. You're wrong, Sokka said quietly. How do you think Katara and I felt when we were given the chance to meet up with our dad? We hadn't seen him in 2 years, Aang. 2 years. All that time we never knew if he was alive or well, we just had to hope and wait. Do you think it was easy for us to follow you to the North Pole instead? Aang lowered his head, still keeping his back to them. Think about it, Sokka advised. He cast a frowning glance at Katara and then stalked back inside the tent, clearly having said his piece. Katara watched her brother leave, torn between wanting to follow to make sure he was okay or to stay and comfort Aang. Sokka had never spoken of that time they had almost gone with Bato to meet up with their dad. It had been his decision to rejoin Aang, and she had agreed because she had known it was the right thing to do. Only now did she realize how hard that choice must have been for Sokka. He had always been good at putting on a cheerful front. Her gaze shifted back to Aang, who stood with his shoulders slumped and his face downcast. She closed her eyes. Speaking to Sokka would have to come later. Right now, Aang was the one who needed her most. She closed the distance between them and slipped her hand in his. It'll be okay, Aang, she said gently. I'm sure the blue spirit is alive. You said yourself that he's a tough guy. Aang continued to stare at the ground. I don't want to abandon him. I know. They were both silent for a moment. I'm sorry you never got to see your dad, Aang said in a small voice. I didn't think I guess I just. It's okay. It's not your fault Dad left to fight in the war. I know, but don't worry about it. Yes, it would have been nice to see our dad, but Sokka and I both knew that we couldn't leave you. She smiled and pulled him into a one-armed hug. You're our family too, remember? His mouth twitched into an answering smile, if somewhat strained. Katara looked up at the moon, seeing beyond the silver to the ships that had carried her father away. Besides, I know we'll see our dad again, just like I know you'll meet up with the blue spirit. He glanced up at her with hopeful eyes. Do you really think so? She nodded. Can't you feel it? Aang's shoulders drooped. I already told you that I can't feel the bond anymore. I only get a sense of our connection when his life is in danger, but I passed out so. I'm not talking about spiritual connections. She placed his hand against his chest, letting him feel the steady beat of his heart. I mean in here. Can't you feel that he's alive? Aang was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I think I can. The smile returned to her lips. Then you don't have to worry. He tightened his grip on her hand. Thanks, Katara. She nodded and gently disengaged herself from him. I'm going to check on Sokka. You should probably eat something while you can. There's some fruit and nuts left for you in Appa's saddle. Aang's stomach gave a loud gurgle. You know what, some food sounds really good right now. Then go eat. She ordered, laughing as she shooed him along with her hands. Aang flashed her a grin and darted over to the saddle, which Momo and Appa had been resting beside. Katara stayed just long enough to hear Aang telling the lemur off for stealing some of his portion of the fruits before she turned and entered the tent. Her brother sat on the floor with a knife and a small piece of wood in his hands. The shavings scattered around him told her that he had been carving. Hey, he said in a flat voice. She sat down opposite him. What are you carving? Dad's boat. He held up the lumpy piece of wood for her to see. Katara bit her lip to stop from smiling. It looked more like a lopsided fish than a boat, but she wasn't going to say that. Sokka continued chipping away at the piece of wood. Is Aang still planning on going after the blue spirit? No. I think he's realized it wouldn't be helping anyone if he did. Good. What about you? She asked, watching him closely. Are you okay? He sighed and placed the knife and crudely carved boat down on the blanket beside him. I miss Dad, he admitted. Don't get me wrong, I don't regret coming with Aang, but sometimes I wish we still could have gone to see Dad. You know what I mean. Katara did know. That was why she pulled him into a tight embrace and buried her face into his shoulder, seeking just as much comfort as she was trying to give. I miss him too, she whispered. His arms came around her, completing the hug, and for a moment they just held each other. Then Sokka broke away, looking awkward and rubbing the base of his neck. His eyes were suspiciously damp. Well, I guess we should probably make sure we have enough supplies for tomorrow, he said, getting to his feet. We've still got a while to go before we reach Omashu, and there's no saying what kind of food we'll be able to find between now and then. Katara's mouth twitched into a smile. I'm sure it'll be fine, Sokka. It's still better to be safe than sorry, and you know how much Momo eats. We could be starving before we know it. Momo? What about you? With the way you stuff your face during every meal, you'd think that you were a flying bison like Appa and have 5 stomachs to fill. Sokka straightened to his full height. I am a warrior. Warriors need their food to keep up their strength. Her smile widened. Ah, of course. I must have forgotten. Sokka gave her a narrowed look as if to say he was not impressed with her teasing. His sister was not repentant and recommended that he make sure to pack enough food to fill his 5 stomachs. Yeah, Sokka said, waving his hand dismissively. You mock me now, but when we next meet the angry jerk, you'll be grateful for my warrior strength. Some of the amusement died in her eyes. I almost forgot. Zuko. It's been 3 weeks since we last saw him. I guess I just forgot about him. There's been so much else going on. Don't let Aang hear you say that. He frets about Zuko just as much as he frets about the blue spirit. You'd think they were best buddies with the way Aang was carrying on when the Northern Water Tribe wouldn't let him into the prison to see the jerk. Sokka spun his finger around in the air beside his head. Air nomads, crazy, I tell you. Katara's brow creased. It was a bit strange how protective Aang had become of Zuko. It also made her wonder what had happened to Zuko. They had been told he had escaped from the Northern Water Tribe, but then it was as if he had just vanished. Katara had to admit, it was kind of weird not having him appear every few days with a new plan to capture Aang. Not that she was missing his presence. They had enough on their plate without having to worry about running away from Prince Zuko as well. But it did make her wonder. Oh. Something was prodding at his side. Wake up, a female voice said. Hey, come on now. I've brought you some soup. Poke. 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 Go away, he groaned, rolling out of her reach. You spoke. And here I was beginning to think you were mute. He sat up on the bed and glowered at the girl standing beside him. She flashed him a smile and held out the bowl of broth. Clearly, she was not intimidated by his glare, or maybe she was just used to it. He didn't know. Her toothy grin and big brown eyes seemed familiar, and he was almost certain that she had given him food before, only he couldn't seem to recall meeting this girl, let alone her name. His chest tightened and he looked around the small room to find something he recognized so that he could reorient himself. The bedroom was sparsely decorated and the furniture was of poor quality. He also noticed that most of the decor seemed to be in greens and browns. None of it was familiar. Hey, the girl said, noting the way the color drained from his cheeks. You okay? You're looking a bit pale. Where am I? He looked at her with wide, anxious eyes. Who are you? She laughed. My name is Faye, and you're in my house, of course. Where else would you be? His chest tightened even more, making it difficult for him to breathe. He didn't remember coming to her house. Why couldn't he remember? Think. A sharp stab of pain lanced through his mind and he clutched at his head with a gasp, quickly losing hold of the images that he had been trying to untangle. Spirits, that hurt. Faye placed the bowl of soup down on the bedside table. What's wrong? Should I get my mum? His brow creased. Your mum. She's a healer. She's been taking care of you for the past 2 days. Don't you remember? He swallowed. No, he did not remember. Hey. I just realized that you can tell me your name now. Faye gave him another of her toothy grins. I hope that you don't mind, but I've been calling you Lee. We weren't sure if you could talk, you see, and Gran seemed to think that you weren't all there in the head because you didn't respond to anything we said and wouldn't eat unless we fed you, so pink suddenly spread all over her cheeks. I'm sorry. That was pretty insensitive of me. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to ignore the violent stabbing in his mind. Every word Faye spoke was only making the pain worse. True, some of the blanks were beginning to fill in now. He could indeed remember being fed soup by the chatty girl, as well as an older woman fussing over his wounds, but there were still so many things that didn't add up, like how he had got to this village in the first place. He touched a hand to his shoulder, feeling the bandage that covered well. He didn't know what it covered, just that it hurt. And that was the problem. He didn't know. It was as if someone had entered his mind and stolen all of the important details, leaving him with just a fragment of his memories. Faye peered at him with hopeful eyes. So, are you going to tell me your name? He swallowed again. I don't actually know. He trailed off, dizzy with the realization. What kind of person couldn't even recall his own name? Faye must have noticed how faint he was feeling. Easy there, she said, steadying him with her hands. I guess you were more injured than we realized. Maybe you hit your head. He shrugged. Maybe. She pursed her lips. I'll get Mum to have a look at you. Maybe she'll be able to figure out what's wrong. In the meantime, I guess I'll stick with calling you Lee. A laugh shook her frame. Wouldn't it be funny if that really was your name? Yeah, he said flatly. Hilarious. A smile twinkled in her eyes. Don't worry, Lee. We'll get your memory back in no time. She paused and rubbed her chin in thought. Now that I think about it, I do have something that might help. He watched as she opened the drawer to the dresser and pulled out a sheathed dagger, something that might have been a pie show tile, and a scraggly piece of parchment. What are those? He asked. We found them hidden in your tunic when the old traveler first brought you to us. She placed them on the bed. Maybe they'll help you remember something. Lee, as he was resigning himself to being called, picked up the wooden counter and examined both of its sides. It just looked like an ordinary white lotus tile to him. He dismissed it with disgust. Next was the parchment, which he was excited to see had something written on it. The characters had blurred together and were slightly faded, but he was still able to make out the words. Follow the path of the ancient ways and you will find what you are seeking, he read aloud. If you are wise, you will not return to this place again. Do you know what it means? Faye asked, looking at him curiously. He shook his head, trying to hold back the frustrated scream that was clawing at his throat. Faye looked disappointed, but she brightened a second later. Well, what about the dagger? She suggested, pushing the knife towards him. Maybe that will strike a chord. Lee sighed and closed his fingers around the hilt. Immediately, a sense of recognition swept through him. He had held this knife before. What? Faye exclaimed, catching sight of his expression. What is it? I know this dagger, he said in a hoarse voice. This was mine. Trembling slightly, he pulled the blade free of the sheath and saw the words etched onto the metal. On one side it said that the dagger had been made in the Earth Kingdom, but it was the other inscription that interested him. Never give up without a fight, he whispered, closing his eyes. The words were so familiar, as if he had said them over and over to himself until they had become ingrained in his mind. Somehow, he knew that this dagger had been important to him, that he must have stared at it for hours to even memorize the engraving. What he didn't understand was why. What had made this dagger so special? He tried to sort through his fragmented memories, pushing past the blanks to connect the pieces. For a moment he thought he almost had something, a whisper of a man with gray hair and warm reddish-brown eyes, but then another stab of pain lanced through his mind and the image was gone. Still, the flash of insight had been enough to help him solve one mystery. A gift, he murmured, tightening his fingers on the hilt. It was a gift. What? Lee opened his eyes and saw Faye wrinkling her brow at him. The dagger, he explained. It was a gift from someone close to me. She clapped her hands together. You remembered something? He looked back at the knife he was holding. Yes, he had remembered something, and like the ripples spreading from a single pebble, he was beginning to catch flashes of other things too. A streak of lightning. A storm-tossed ocean. Fire. Betrayal. Pain. The images were terrifying and confusing, but they were also coming too fast, slicing through his tender mind like 100 knives. He couldn't handle the onslaught and soon there were black dots swarming before his eyes. Lee. Hands gripped his arms. Only then did he realize that he was shaking. He went still almost instantly and stared at Faye, his face chalk white. I don't think you should be trying to force your memories right now, she said, looking rather pale herself. Yeah, Lee agreed in a faint voice. Probably not a good idea. His head was still throbbing from the rush of images. I'm going to go get my mom, okay? He nodded. Faye gestured to the bowl of broth. Try to eat some soup. It might make you feel better. Without waiting for his response, she stood up from the bed and left the room. Lee sighed and ran a trembling hand over his face. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew that he didn't like it. The scariest part, however, was that he wasn't certain if he even wanted to remember what had happened to him. His fingertips brushed against the scarred flesh that skewed the left side of his face. Fire, he whispered. That was all his past had seemed to be, fire and pain. Why would he want to remember that? Because that's who you are, a woman's voice spoke in his mind. Someone who keeps fighting even though it's hard. Lee squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't know why hearing that voice made him want to cry. Somehow, that was the most heartbreaking realization of all. Oh. 2 days had passed since Lee had first come to his senses, or so Chiao, Faye's grandmother, had liked to call his return to cognitive awareness. Before that, it seemed that he had done nothing but stare blankly unless someone forced him to move. It was no wonder that they had thought him mute. He hadn't spoken once. Lee didn't like to think about those days. It was shameful to consider how much of a wreck he had been, and he didn't like the fact that there were so many holes in his memories. He could now remember the old man who had brought him to the village, but he couldn't remember where the old man had found him or any of the time that they had traveled together. He knew that he had been injured on his right shoulder, but he didn't remember how or why. Then there were the other memories, the ones that made his head hurt with just the slightest touch. Faye's mother said that he had mostly likely gone into shock. Whatever had happened to him had been so painful that his mind had blocked it out, like a self-defense mechanism. That wasn't exactly reassuring to Lee, who was still trying to piece together his fragmented past. It didn't help that the only facts he had managed to ascertain for certain were that he had been running from something and that it was probably a good thing that no one knew his real name. Faye tapped him on the shoulder. Hey, Lee. Care to share your thoughts? You're being awfully quiet. Lee was about to respond when he spotted a blue mask nestled on the back shelf of one of the trader's stalls. His body stilled and his heart sped up. Images flashed through his mind, a figure in black leaping over rooftops, a mask glinting from within the shadows, and then the steel dance of dual dao swords slicing through a ring of enemies. Lee. He shook his head and moved towards the trader. How much for that blue mask? 2 copper pieces. Lee felt within the pockets of his borrowed clothes and pulled out the copper pieces Chiao had given him for chopping firewood. Money and mask were exchanged. Lee and Faye continued walking down the market street. Why'd you get that mask? She asked curiously. It just felt right, he said with a shrug. She pursed her lips. If you say so. Lee chose to ignore her remark. He knew that Faye found him a bit odd at times. He also didn't care. To him, she was just as odd, not to mention talked far too much. Still, Her family had taken him in when he had been injured and could barely string 2 words together. He had to be grateful for that. They had just finished collecting the groceries and were heading back to her house when they saw the Fire Nation soldiers coming from the opposite direction. Lee didn't pay much attention to them at first, but his head pulsed when he saw one stop and set fire to the closest market stall. The rest of the group just laughed. "Oh, no," Faye murmured, stopping in her tracks. "Poor Cai. He loves his cabbages so much too." A crease formed on Lee's brow. "Why isn't anyone doing anything to help? They're all just standing there watching. What can we do?" Faye gave him a helpless look. "There aren't any benders left in this town, and the Fire Nation doesn't exactly tolerate disobedience. Look at what they did to Cai's cabbages, and that was just because he didn't have enough money to pay their stupid taxes." Lee's head was throbbing now. This wasn't right. None of this was right. "Come on," she said, tugging at his arm. "We'd better go. They'll start harassing us soon." But Lee wasn't listening. He had just spotted a pair of dual deo swords hanging on display on the wall of the blacksmith's workshop. Without a word, he shoved the pot of vegetables he had been holding at Faye and then slipped the mask over his face. "Lee, what are you?" Her voice faded as he ran, moving with an instinctive agility that had him half running along the side of the wall as he snatched the blades from the display and headed for the group of firebenders. Dimly, he could hear the blacksmith yelling at him, but he ignored that too. His heart was pounding with adrenaline and for once everything made sense. For once, he didn't feel like he was wearing someone else's skin. More shouts followed him, attracting the attention of the firebenders. They moved into formation even while the cabbage merchant continued to bemoan the fate of his prized vegetables. It was 4 against 1, but Lee wasn't afraid. He was calm. Almost happy. This was what he was used to. This was natural. So he didn't think to question why his mind told him to duck, he just did it, allowing him to slide right under the stream of fire that had been blasted his way. It was a pleasure to see the slack-jawed expressions on the firebenders' faces, but he didn't pause to savor the moment. Instead, he lunged forward in a flurry of steel, knocking down one of the soldiers with a sharp thrust to the side and then swinging around to deflect an oncoming fireball with the flat of his blades. The firebender closest to him let out a growl and charged. In a display of rare grace, Lee dropped to one knee and brought the hilts of his blades up into the man's chin, knocking him clean off his feet. Without pausing, Lee closed the distance between himself and the remaining 2 firebenders, drawing them in like a vortex with his swords even as he deflected and dodged their blows. It was as if he could sense their every move, as if every shift of their feet and every slight adjustment to their arms allowed him to know what firebending kata they would use next. It wasn't long before he had incapacitated the opponent on his left, though he was careful not to aim to kill. As the man fell to join the other wounded soldiers, Lee readied his swords in an offensive stance, already preparing for the next attack. Who are you?" the last firebender stammered, taking a step backwards. Lee's mouth curved into a smile behind his mask. "You can call me the Blue Spirit." Chapter 3, Decisions and Rumors. No one moved. Lee could feel the other people in the market watching him, feel their stunned gazes crawling all over his skin, but the adrenaline was still coursing through his veins and he couldn't bring himself to care what they thought in that moment. There were 4 unconscious firebenders at his feet and it was he who had brought them down, he who had dodged and deflected their attacks like it was the most natural thing in the world. Because it had been. Because he knew that he had done this before. He stared at the swords in his hands, feeling a sense of kinship with the twin blades. Yes, this was right. This was him. Even now, he could still hear the song of steel ringing in his ears, whispering of past battles and the deadly dance he had performed over and over with nothing but 2 swords and the shadows to protect him. "I am the Blue Spirit." Lee could have laughed with relief. It was as if a piece of the puzzle had at last fallen into place and now he could see the beginnings of the final image. He finally had something onto which he could hold. He had an identity that was concrete and, even better, it was all his. True, the fact that he had been a masked warrior hiding behind an alias did unsettle him for the implications that went with needing such secrecy, but it was something. He was no longer Lee the Unknown, he was Lee the Blue Spirit. Footsteps sounded from behind him. He whirled around and brought his swords up to attack, only to pause when he saw Faye staring at him with wide brown eyes. What little color left in her cheeks drained away and she swallowed as her gaze flickered from him to the blood-stained metal pressing against her neck. Slowly, he lowered the blades from her throat. Lee. Her voice was small. Nervous. Wordlessly, he brought the Deo swords together to form one weapon and walked past her, knowing that she would follow if she still wanted anything to do with him. It was obvious that he had shaken her. The townspeople who had been standing in the market square hurried to move out of his way, but he could also hear their murmurs echoing around him like a swarm of buzzard wasps. So much for good intentions. Gritting his teeth, he ignored the sounds of their curiosity and distrust and stopped in front of the blacksmith's workshop. The smithy paled behind the mass of dark hair that obscured most of his face, his eyes widening. "Sorry for the blood," Lee said flatly, placing the dual blades on the counter. He turned to leave, not wanting to linger in the market with so many people scrutinizing him. The smell of fear, however odd, was pungent in his nostrils, and he knew that wariness wasn't being directed towards the incapacitated firebenders. Besides, the longer he stayed, the more likely it was that someone would figure out he was the same boy who had been walking with Faye. Nothing good could come from that. It was best just to go. Wait. Lee glanced over his shoulder at the blacksmith, his head tilted slightly in question. Some of the ruddiness had returned to the man's face and his mouth was set with determination. The blacksmith grabbed the scabbard that had been hanging on the display wall and then pushed it, along with the broadswords, towards Lee. "Keep them," he said. "I know you'll put these blades to better use than any customer who could afford to purchase them from my shop, Swordmaster." Lee's eyes widened a fraction. He bowed in thanks and accepted the swords, which he cleaned, sheathed, and slung over his shoulder. He could not reject such a gift, not when he knew how much he needed the weapons. He turned to find Faye hovering at his elbow, looking pale but resolved. "Lee," she said again, squaring her shoulders in a way that told him he was about to be bombarded with a lot of questions. "Not here," he hissed, grabbing her by the arm and leading her away from the group of listening traders and shoppers. She squeaked and tried to slip free of his grip. Lee stopped and glared at her through the slits of his mask. He pulled her closer so that no one else would be able to hear his words. "Look, do you want your answers or not?" he growled in her ear. "Yes, but..." "Then meet me back at your house. We'll talk then." She glanced up at him. "Why can't we just walk back together?" "Because anyone who cared to pay attention would remember that you had come to the market with a boy and will easily be able to put the two together if they see me leaving with you." He cast a wary glance around the marketplace. "Just talking to you now is putting us both at risk." "Damn it. I should have thought of this sooner." He froze as he caught sight of the trader who had sold him the mask and for a moment they just stared at each other. Lee's stomach twisted with unease. The trader had seen his face, had seen him buy the mask. What should he do now? The old man did not break eye contact and simply nodded. A breath escaped Lee's lips. It seemed as if the trader was saying that he would keep the secret. Lee would have liked to have got concrete proof, but there wasn't time for that now. There were too many people, too many ears listening. He had to get out of here, not just for his own protection, but for every person who knew what he looked like under the mask. The old fear was returning, reminding him that he had been found half dead and stranded in this town for a reason. Faye gripped his wrist. "Lee, just tell me." "At the house," he said firmly. He released her on the words and sprinted in the opposite direction, purposely pushing through the crowd to draw their attention away from Faye. The gasps and shouts told him that his plan was working. He didn't let the noise distract him. Instead, he increased his speed and jumped onto the wooden crate near the tavern, using the momentum to propel his body upwards. His fingers closed on the rim of the roof and he flipped up with one hand, landing in a half-crouch on the tiles. A twinge passed through his right shoulder. Lee ignored the pain and shot back to his feet, making a running leap for the neighboring building. "Don't let anyone follow," his mind chanted. "The blue spirit comes like a shadow and will leave like a shadow. He always makes a clean escape." Lee's jaw clenched as he made the next jump, letting instinct take over to guide his feet. The townspeople's shouts and exclamations reverberated around him, but they were nothing to him in that moment. He was alive with the pounding of his heart and the familiar exhilaration that surged through him with every gravity-defying leap. No one could catch him up here. He was as swift and silent as the shadows. He was the Blue Spirit. But he was also a boy with a scar on his face. It was that which had him increasing his speed, determined to make the market-goers believe that he had left the town for good. Because someone had caught him once. The knowledge pulsed in every painful throb of his mind, hissing of danger. Someone had hurt him, could even now be hunting him. He would not, could not, let Faye and her family get caught up in that too. He had to warn them. He had to run. Oh. The sun was setting when Lee arrived back at the house, tired but otherwise unharmed. After leaving the town and bundling the mask and swords in his outer robe, it had been easy enough for him to circuit back around to meet up with Faye at her home, though it had taken much longer. Of course, he knew that his ruse was not foolproof, but it would at least buy him some time. "You came back," Faye exclaimed, standing up from where she'd been sitting on the doorstep and taking an impulsive step towards him. Lee raised his good eyebrow. "You thought I wouldn't." She had the grace to blush. "I don't know. After everything that happened, I guess I just..." The color darkened on her cheeks and she lowered her gaze. "Well, I guess I just don't really know what to think of you anymore." "Right." His jaw tightened. "Well, I'm sorry I'm not the weak little nobody you thought I was." "No." She gripped his arm, stopping him from walking away. "That's not what I meant. You just surprised me, that's all." A smile curved her lips. "I spent 2 days feeding you soup because you could barely lift your own spoon. I wasn't exactly expecting you to turn out to be some master swordsman who can take down 4 firebenders by himself." Some of the anger faded from his eyes. It was a mistake to attack those soldiers. He averted his face. "I've just made things worse for everyone." "Why would you say that?" "Sure, it was scary to watch, but what you did was amazing." "No, it was reckless and stupid." He placed the bundle down and sat on the step, placing his head in his hands. "I don't know who I am, Faye. I don't know what I've been running from or how I got injured. That should have been enough to make me cautious, but seeing those men burn that stall just felt so wrong. I couldn't stand there and watch it happen. So, what's the problem?" He lifted his hands away to meet her gaze. "You asked me earlier why I bought that mask." She nodded. "It's because I used to wear one just like that. I was the Blue Spirit." "Who?" "The Blue Spirit," he repeated. "It's a character from a popular theater show. I must have taken on the alias to protect my real identity, but don't you see? I just blew my cover in the worst way possible. The trader who sold me the mask knows what I look like. Maybe there are some other people in the market who will be able to figure out the connection as well, and then there's you and your family." She planted her hands on her hips. "Hey, my family and I are not blabbermouths. Just what are you accusing us of?" "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm trying to tell you that you're in danger now because of me." Faye's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Lee sighed and ran a hand through the short, uneven strands of hair that covered his head. "Think about it, Faye. I took down 4 firebenders. You can't tell me they were the only ones occupying the town. More will come, and they will want to know who I am. All it would take is for one person to give a hint, just a hint, that the Blue Spirit is the same boy who's been staying with your family, and then the Fire Nation soldiers will come here to investigate. You and I both know what that would mean." Her cheeks paled, but she held her head high. "Well, then you can just drive them away again with your swords." Lee shook his head. "I can't stay here. It will only make things worse. At least if I'm gone they can't punish you for harboring the Blue Spirit if the truth gets out." "You're just going to leave?" she asked in a small voice. "Just like that?" "I have to." He stared at the bundle where the mask and swords lay hidden. "I'll admit that maybe at first I wasn't sure if I wanted to remember my past, but now I know I have to find out the truth. I have to know how I got like this." She sat next to him and clasped his forearm. "But, Lee, don't you think it would be more dangerous to leave when your memory still hasn't returned?" What if you run into the people who hurt you and you don't even know it? He shifted away from her touch. That's why I have to go. Try to understand, I don't know if I was running because I'm the blue spirit and got injured or if there is something about my real identity that somehow put me in danger. If I stay here, I might never know what really happened, but if I leave I have a chance of discovering the truth. But I don't want to live my life in fear, Faye. I'd rather die trying to regain my memories than spend every day wondering if someone is going to recognize me, yet not even knowing why I should be afraid, let alone if it's the mask or the face underneath that should be my main concern. A reluctant smile tugged at her lips. I can see now why you held onto that dagger. He frowned. What do you mean? You really don't give up without a fight, do you? An image flickered in his mind of a woman with amber eyes and long, dark hair. Suddenly, he could hear her words echoing in his mind once again. Because that's who you are. Someone who keeps fighting even though it's hard. Lee closed his eyes, conscious of the way his heart clenched with a pain he did not understand. No, he said softly. I don't think I do. They were both silent for a moment. Faye tucked her legs up against her chest and rested her chin on her knees, staring out into the distance. He couldn't help but note that she looked unhappy. I guess you'll be leaving soon then, huh? She observed, still not looking at him. It's better this way. The longer I stay here, the more dangerous it will be for everyone. Where will you go? Lee thought for a moment. I'm going to try find what I was looking for. Huh? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the scrap of parchment. This isn't my handwriting, I know because I checked. Someone must have written this message for me, which means that I was searching for something before I lost my memories. Maybe if I follow the path of the ancient ways like the note says, I'll be able to discover something or someone to help me. You know what it means. No, but that doesn't mean I can't try. There has to be information about the path of the ancient ways somewhere. At least it would be a start. She exhaled in a loud puff of breath and stood up. Come on then. He looked at her questioningly. Faye's toothy grin came into play. You didn't think you'd be able to leave without saying goodbye to Gran and Mom, did you? Besides, they might have some advice for where you should go next. His brow furrowed. You think so? Don't know, but there's only one way to find out. Lee nodded and gathered up the bundle containing his blue spirit disguise, then followed her inside the house to where Faye's mother and Xiao were preparing some kind of herbal concoction. It didn't take long for the teens to explain the situation. While both women were stunned to discover that their guest had managed to defeat 4 firebenders with a pair of Dao swords, Lee was relieved to note that there was no fear in their eyes. He would never admit it aloud, but it bothered him how wary most of the townspeople had become after the fight. He had only been trying to help, but instead they had thrown it back in his face and acted like he was going to attack them next. It was nice to know that Faye's family still trusted him. So, you're planning on leaving us, boy, Xiao said, folding her arms. Lee nodded. I think it's for the best. Well, I always knew you were different, but I never expected you'd turn out to be some masked vigilante. To be fair, Faye's mother pointed out, I don't think he did either. Lee rubbed the back of his neck. Right. Anyway, we wanted to know if you had any idea where he could begin his search, Faye interrupted. He thinks if he learns more about the path of the ancient ways that he might be able to find something to help him regain his memories. Lee narrowed his eyes. I was just about to say that. Xiao tapped a gnarled finger to her chin. Well, I don't know about any ancient ways, but it couldn't hurt to try your luck at Omashu. The city is not far from here and I've heard they have a library filled with scrolls about the Earth Kingdom and its history. Either way, Omashu is a big place and sees many travelers come and go. Even if you don't find the information you need, there's a chance you might run into someone who will be able to help you regain your memories. I guess it's worth a shot, Lee agreed. I have to begin somewhere, and Omashu is as good as any other place. You just be careful while you're out there searching, Faye's mother said in a grim voice. The Fire Nation isn't going to forget what you've done, and you admitted yourself that you're uncertain whether it's this blue spirit alias of yours that originally put you in danger or if it was something about your real identity. That's a lot of risks you're taking, Lee. He lowered his gaze to the floor, knowing this to be true. He also knew, however, that he had no choice. Qiao placed a hand on his shoulder. If you want my advice, you'd do well to keep that mask on while you're traveling. Better to have people chasing a shadow than to track your real self, especially with that scar of yours. Li touched a hand to his left cheek. She was probably right. His scar was large and far too memorable. There was no saying who might recognize the description of his face, and that was something he didn't want to risk when he still knew so little about the boy with the scar. Much better to stick to the blue spirit. I understand, he said. Good. Fei's mother smiled sadly at him. I suppose you'll need supplies for your journey. Li's face warmed. He'd seen for himself that the family was not affluent. No, really, he said awkwardly. I'll be fine. I'm sure I can. Please, she interjected. I'll feel much more secure knowing that you didn't leave my home destitute. Swallowing his pride, he bowed and placed his right fist just below his left hand, which he kept open and pointed upward. Thank you. As he straightened to his full height, he saw Qiao giving him an odd look, but the old woman said nothing. Li dismissed the matter and instead focused on helping Fei's mother pack some provisions for him. Food, money, and a flask of water were tucked inside the bag, then she led him into the other room where she and her daughter slept. We're lucky my husband's clothes fit you so well, she said, placing a clean set of garments inside the bag. You can keep the boots I lent you, but I'm afraid we don't have any others to spare. You'll have to make those ones last. Li shifted uncomfortably. He'd been told that Fei's father had gone to fight in the war, however, it had been 5 years since the family had last heard anything. It seemed wrong to take the soldier's clothes now, but Li knew that he didn't have much of a choice. His own clothes had been torn and bloody and he hadn't even been wearing any footwear. The one pair will do fine, he said. I mean to travel light, anyway. But, thank you. A smile flittered across her face. You're not used to accepting things from people, are you? He shrugged. Maybe. Well, I guess that's a good sign, she continued. Means you can take care of yourself. She handed him the bag. Either way, I hope this will help to make your journey easier. Li took the pack and slung it over his shoulder. He was careful not to let it obstruct the access he had to his swords, which he'd also strapped to his back. Mumbling another thank you, he turned to leave. Li. He paused. Yes. Be safe. The corners of his mouth lifted. I will. He left the room and picked up the blue mask from the table in the living area, then said his goodbyes to Qiao and Fei. It was time to go. As he exited the house, he was conscious of footsteps following him. The light tread told him it was Fei. What is it? He asked. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground. Moments passed. His brow furrowed and he was just about to tell her to say something when she suddenly rushed forward and threw her arms around his middle. His eyes widened and he stiffened from his head to his toes. Fei was hugging him. For some reason, all he could think was that her hair was tickling his chin and she smelled like the herbs used in her mother's medicine, a hint of astragalus, salvia, and tankei. I'm going to miss you, Li. Her voice got swallowed up in his tunic. He stood there with his arms held awkwardly away from her, not sure how to respond. Eventually, she pulled back and raised her face to meet his gaze. His heart thudded against his ribs. There was something in her eyes that whispered of more than friendship and casual conversations, something that made him conscious of the fact he was a boy and she was a rather cute girl. His breathing sped up. It would be easy to lean in, to close the distance between them as he knew she wanted him to do. Yet even as his gaze dropped to her lips, he realized that he could not do it. The blue spirit always makes a clean escape. Li stepped back and placed the mask over his face. Goodbye, Fei. He was gone on the words, fading into the shadows of the night. He knew that a door was closing, separating him from the girl with the toothy smile and the life that could have been, but he did not mourn the loss. Li was not and could never be an ordinary Earth Kingdom boy. He was the blue spirit, and somewhere out there was the other half of himself, the half who had been watched over by a woman with amber eyes and dark hair, the half who had received a pearl-handled dagger with engravings on either side as a gift. Now, with only a pie show tile and a scrap of parchment to direct him. He had to find that boy. Lee exhaled deeply as he ran, guided by the silver light of the moon. It was time to begin his search. Oh. It was quiet in the room. Candles flickered, but the two men paid no heed to the dimming of the lights. Their attention was fixed on the board between them where a lotus flower began to form as they placed each new tile on the squares. When both players had run out of tiles, they looked up at each other with newfound respect. "Welcome, brother," the man in the green tunic said, clasping his hands together on the table. "The white lotus opens wide to those who know her secrets." General Iroha's mouth quirked into a smile. "I'm counting on it. There is much that needs to be done. You might have heard that I've started the call, but I'm going to need your help to get the news to the rest of the order." The man's eyes widened. "Then you must be General Iroha, the Grand Lotus." Iroha nodded. "But please call me Yingja. It's not safe for me to use my name in these parts. My brother has branded me a traitor and my niece will stop at nothing to capture me and take me back to the Fire Nation. It is best for everyone if people believe me to be nothing more than a humble Earth Kingdom refugee." "I understand, Yingja." "Excellent." Iroha leaned forward. "Now, I have a very important question for you." "Yes. Do you have any tea?" Iroha gave a mournful sigh. "It's been so long since I've tasted a good cup of ginseng, though I'd be willing to have any flavor at this point. You wouldn't believe how difficult it is to find the right plants to brew your own while on the run. I thought I could make some with the white dragon bush I found, but, he gave a belly-rumbling chuckle, "well, that didn't turn out so well." The man in the green tunic blinked a few times. I'm sure we can find you some tea, Yingja. Just let me ask Konglin." Iroha's eyes twinkled. "Thank you. It will be much appreciated." The agent stood up and left the room. Several minutes later, he returned with a small, balding man who was carrying a tray with a cup and a steaming pot of tea on top. "No doubt the aforementioned Konglin." Iroha sniffed the air. "Ah, ginseng," he observed. "My favorite." Konglin knelt by the table and poured the tea for him. One sip had the old general sighing in satisfaction. Now that was good tea. When he was halfway through his drink, he cradled the cup in his hand and glanced at the two agents now seated opposite him. "Perhaps there is something else you can help me with, Konglin," Iroha mused. "I will be happy to be of service," Konglin replied. "It has been a long time since we've had a Grand Lotus stay with us." Iroha shook his head. "This is something personal, though I admit I had once hoped." He trailed off with a sigh. "Well, I guess there is no saying what the future will bring." Konglin clasped his hands on his lap. "What is it you wish to know, Yingja?" "It's about my nephew," Iroha admitted. "We were separated during the Siege of the North. I was just wondering if any of the agents who have been tracking the Fire Nation's movements have heard anything about what happened to him." The two White Lotus members exchanged a glance. "There have been some rumors," Konglin said in a grave voice, "but I'm afraid you will not like what they have to say." Iroha tightened his grip on the teacup. "Tell me." "Apparently, Princess Azula found her brother half dead in the ocean. She was supposed to be taking him back to the Fire Nation, where he would be imprisoned, but something went wrong. There are differing opinions about what happened after that, but the general consensus is still the same." Konglin shook his head in what might have been regret. "I'm sorry, General Iroha, but your nephew is dead." The cup slipped from Iroha's fingers, spilling the rest of the tea on the floor. He did not even think to correct the other man for using his proper name. "No," he said in a strained voice. "That's not possible." "I am sorry," Konglin repeated. Iroha stared at his hands, which he dimly realized were trembling. In his mind, he could see the boy with the scar that should have never marred his face, that strong, loyal, and loving boy who had tried so hard to meet Ose's expectations, no matter how impossible. "I should not have left him," Iroha whispered, closing his eyes. He had placed the world before his nephew, but for many years now it was Zuko who had meant the world to him. Hearing Konglin's words was like losing Lu Ten all over again. Iroha wished with all of his heart that he could turn time back and ignore Pakku's warning. If he had a second chance, he would stand by his nephew until the end, regardless of what danger it presented to himself or how it would impact the Order of the White Lotus. But he could not change the past, he could only change the future. "Are you sure those rumors are true?" Iroh asked, straightening his back. "Is there any physical proof, like a body?" The reports were quite explicit, though it was suggested the most likely cause of death was drowning. "I don't believe a body was ever found." Iroh's eyes gleamed. "Then there's still a chance." The two men exchanged another glance. Iroh stood up and faced the two White Lotus members with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I will have to leave you much sooner than I thought. Please, continue to spread the news to the rest of the Order outposts that the time has come to prepare for the next phase. We will need all the aid we can get if we are to end this war." "And what of you?" Konglin asked. "Where will you go next?" Iroh looked out the window to where he could see the moon shining in a silver crescent against the night sky. "I'm going to fulfill a promise I made to myself 3 years ago." He had sworn when Zuko had first been banished that he would never abandon him, that he would stay and protect his young relative for as long as it was necessary. Today, he had discovered that he had almost failed in his duty, but he would not let such a mistake happen again. "We shall meet again, my nephew." It didn't matter how long it took. He refused to lose another son. Chapter 4, Chasing Shadows. The fish was taunting him. Lee didn't know how many times he had thrown, stabbed, and lunged with his makeshift spear at the slippery creature, but every time he had missed. His prey didn't even have the decency to swim upstream to escape him in fear. Instead, it would dive in and out of the water, showing off its silver scales, or else just swim around him in circles. It was infuriating, but it was also humiliating. The blue spirit could take down 4 firebenders with his swords without breaking a sweat, yet here he was unable to catch one measly fish. "Just stay still," Lee growled, raising his spear to strike. The fish weaved in a diamond-like pattern around his legs and then paused. Quick as lightning, Lee brought the sharpened point down to impale his would-be dinner. A silver tail flicked out in retaliation and the stream rose up to meet him, splashing him in the face and drenching him from head to foot. He spat out the water that had got into his mouth and scowled as droplets dripped from his hair and clothes. Looking far too pleased, the fish darted to his left and then waited as if daring him to try again. Lee made a strangled noise of frustration. "This is impossible," he groaned, throwing the spear on the ground. Clearly, he had not been much of a fisherman in his past. Just like he had discovered, much to his dismay, that he was not good at starting fires either. It had taken him hours to get his campfire going the first night he had headed out on his own for Omashu. After 2 days of traveling, he thought that he was finally beginning to get the hang of it, but it still took him at least 10 attempts before he could create a flame. The action of striking the rocks together just felt so foreign to him, and the rocks themselves seemed so clumsy and awkward in his hands. It didn't make sense, but then he was beginning to realize that there were a lot of things about him that didn't make sense. Lee sighed. It looked as if he was going to be eating stale rations again. Voices drifted towards him. Snatching up his belongings, he ran into the trees and dropped to the ground so that he was completely hidden. A group of men in Fire Nation armor appeared a few seconds later. "So then I asked her if she wanted to join me in the back room," one of the soldiers was saying, who stood out for the ridiculously large mustache drooping from his upper lip. "And what did she say?" The spearman on the left responded, kneeling by the stream to fill up his waterskin. "She told me that she would on one condition. I had to get rid of the mustache." The soldier shook his head with a faint sigh. "Well, naturally I had to put her straight. Sweetheart," I said, "I don't care if you are the red peony and the most beautiful dancer in the Fire Nation, I've been grooming this mustache for 3 years and I'm not about to cut it off for you." The group of men laughed and continued filling up their waterskins, still chatting among themselves about old conquests and the pretty Earth Kingdom women they'd met during their time abroad. Lee scowled and wondered when they were going to leave. This was not a conversation he wanted to hear, especially since Mustache Man loved to go into lurid detail about all the adventures he'd had behind closed doors. Lee's cheeks flooded with heat just thinking about it. A man sporting the armor of a higher-ranked officer marched into the clearing. "What are you all doing sitting around like a bunch of gossiping women?" he demanded. "Hurry it up." We've been ordered to join the blockade in the pass to the Kolau Mountains. There are rumors that the Avatar is heading for Omashu. The Avatar? Mustache Man exclaimed, dropping his waterskin. Are you sure, Captain? The spearman asked, looking a bit alarmed. Of course I'm sure, you idiots. Now get your act together and move. I'm not having my regiment be labeled as A. The captain frowned as he knelt to examine something on the ground. What's this? Lee's eyes widened as he saw the captain pick up a familiar dagger, which glinted with a black sheen in the afternoon light. The knife must have slipped free when he'd been running. This was not good. What is it, Captain? Mustache Man asked, moving to stand beside his superior. This is not an ordinary dagger. The captain removed the blade from its sheath and turned it on either side to read the inscriptions. Only someone of very high rank would carry a dagger like this. The quality of the materials used is extremely fine, and the craftsmanship itself is the best I've seen. Not even our most prized blacksmiths in the Fire Nation could do better. Seems odd that the owner would just leave it here, Mustache Man observed. You'd think a person would notice losing something like that. Unless the owner never left. All the blood seemed to freeze in Lee's veins. He realized that his footprints were still visible on the ground and led straight to his hiding position. His heart thudded against his ribs and he closed his fingers around the sheath encasing his Deo blades. There were only two options he could take in that moment, flee and hope the soldiers would not follow, or fight and hope that he could win. Since Lee was not about to lose the only item he had that he knew personally belonged to him, he decided to go with the latter. He slipped the blue mask over his face and gripped the combined hilts of his swords. Instinct told him how to remove the blades without making a sound, and it was with equal quietness that he rose to his feet and strapped the scabbard to his back, freeing up one of his hands. He'd have to be quick if he wanted to do this without getting hurt or captured. There were 7 men in total, 3 firebenders, including the captain, 3 spearmen, and a long-range fighter specializing in a crossbow. The odds were not in Lee's favor, but none of the soldiers had noticed his presence yet, too busy discussing the dagger and the whereabouts of its owner. In that, he still had the element of surprise. Crossbow first. Lee noticed that the long-range fighter was standing a little apart from the group and that none of the others were paying much attention to him. He darted out from the trees with cat-like swiftness and clamped a hand over the archer's mouth, pulling him back into the shadows before anyone could notice. There was a brief struggle before he got the man down, now barely conscious, and pinned his arms with his own armor and used a ripped bit of his shirt as a gag. There, that should hold him for now. Sheathing the blades, Lee picked up the fallen crossbow and quiver. He slotted a bolt into the correct position and took aim at one of the firebenders, knowing that he had to get this right the first time. He released the catch and watched the heavy arrow soar through the air before it buried itself into the man's midriff where the leather armor did not cover. Shouts echoed in Lee's ears as he fixed a new bolt in place and fired. This time he hit one of the spearmen in the chest and knocked the man to his knees. Now, he only had one more shot before he would have to switch to close-range combat. The crossbow was too slow to be used effectively for long and it was much harder to deal out an incapacitating blow in one hit. Even still, the wounds created by the weapon would at least help to even the scales for him, if only to impair his opponent's fighting abilities. But he would have to be quick. Some of the men were already heading to his position, having guessed the general direction from where the arrows had been fired. He also knew that the rest of the regiment could not be far away. The last thing he needed was for one of them to call for reinforcements. Exhaling deeply, Lee aligned the crossbow with the closest soldier and released the catch. He missed his target by several inches, thrown off by the man's movement, but there wasn't time to curse his poor aim. He dropped the crossbow without a second thought. The familiar song of steel rang in his ears as he unsheathed his blades, then charged through the trees towards his opponents, letting his instincts take over as he let go of the boy with the scar and became one with his mask. Duck, slash, parry. He moved like a whirlwind of steel, guided by the memories of past battles, which whispered words of advice to his mind in shadowed echoes and images. He was the Blue Spirit, and he was not going to lose this fight. 2 spears rose to stab him in the chest. Lee swung his swords around in a sweeping arc and knocked the spears aside, then counterattacked in a swift, outward thrust that sent both men sprawling. Heat brushed his back. He moved just in time to avoid being struck by a fireball. Breathing hard, he turned to see the 3 firebenders closing in on him. He sensed rather than saw one of the spearmen get up to flank him from behind. The other 2 were still lying on the ground, too wounded to move. "Think you can take all of us down?" Mustache Man taunted, holding his palm up as if he were about to unleash a stream of fire. "Careful, Nianzu," the captain warned. "You should not underestimate the blue spirit. He might be just one man, but he is known to be very dangerous." Li stared at the men warily, his eyes flickering from one face to the next to see who would make the first move. He paused when his gaze came to rest on the firebender standing on the left. The man was slumped forward slightly and had blood spreading in a dark stain on his midriff. Li's eyes narrowed as he realized that was the one he had shot with the crossbow. He knew it would be easy enough to take the wounded firebender out, but the other soldiers would be bound to attack if he tried to make a move. That was a risk he wasn't willing to take when he was surrounded. "I need a distraction." Suddenly, he remembered how the fish had diverted his attention when he had been trying to catch it earlier. He kicked hard at the gritty dirt and grains of sand and mud flicked upwards. There was a grunt and the 3 firebenders brought their arms up in reflex to shield their eyes. Already running, Li lashed out at the wounded soldier with his blades, incapacitating him with a controlled slice to the man's torso and legs. The sound of wood whistling through air had Li dodging to the side, just missing being impaled by the tip of the spearman's weapon. He growled and brought his leg down in a ruthless axe kick, snapping the spear clean in half. The spearman's eyes widened. A second later, he was joining the injured firebender on the ground, rendered useless by a swift thrust to his side. "Stop him!" Li didn't know who had shouted, but he didn't wait to see. Swinging his swords back into an offensive stance, he ducked a fireball and then lunged for Mustache Man, breaking through his defenses to knock him down with a hard kick to the stomach. Grimly, he brought the hilt of his blade down against the man's head. The blow had either knocked him out or killed him, but Li hoped for the former. It wasn't like he wanted to kill these men. He just couldn't afford to be gentle either. Arms suddenly latched around his middle. He struggled, but the arms clamped down harder and trapped his swords to his side. "Got you." The captain grunted in his ear. "Now drop the swords or you'll soon find out what it means to be embraced by fire." Heart pounding, Li released his grip on his blades and relaxed just enough to make the captain think that he was completely subdued. "Good. Now I want you to." Li rammed his head back against the other's face. Bone crunched and the man cried out. A vicious kick to the shins did the rest. The arms that had been trapping him disappeared and he quickly snatched his swords up from the ground and spun in a flash of steel. The captain slumped to his knees, clutching at his stomach where blood trickled out in ribbons of red. Blood was also splattered over his face from where his nose had been broken. How? He choked out. Li brought the Dao swords together to form one blade, then reached down and removed the dagger from the man's belt. He paused. "You should get a healer to look at that wound," he said, gesturing to the gash on the captain's stomach. "I tried not to cut through any vital organs, but it's possible I miscalculated with that last strike." The captain's eyes widened. Without waiting for a response, Li sheathed his blades and headed for the trees to gather up his belongings. If the rest of the regiment had not already been alerted from the sounds of fighting, they would no doubt be along soon to discover what had happened to their captain and fellow soldiers. It was best to hurry. Scrambling into his boots, he slung his pack over his shoulder and then turned to leave when he spotted the crossbow and quiver of bolts lying on the ground. A frown tugged at his lips. The crossbow was not his weapon of choice. He had instinctively known how to use it, but he had realized rather quickly that he was not an expert at hitting his target. Still, it had come in handy, and there was no saying what other dangers he would face during his passage through the Kolau Mountains, especially if it was true that the Fire Nation was forming a blockade. "Better to be safe than sorry," he muttered, snatching up the crossbow and quiver. He fastened the weapon to his pack and then did a quick search of the other soldiers' pockets for anything useful. There were a few money pouches too light to hold many coins and some dried meat that would serve as extra rations. The coil of rope attached to the archer's waistband also caught his eye. He decided to take that too and shoved the lot in his pack, which he then slung over his shoulder. The quiver of bolts soon joined the bag, but he did not begrudge the added weight. A crunching, cracking sound told him that heavy machinery was approaching, snapping through branches. Lee checked to make sure that he had not forgotten anything and then headed deeper into the trees. He would have to get far away from the stream if he wanted to avoid being pursued. However, as he ran, it was not the thought of being chased that troubled him. It was the one sentence that he had overheard the captain say to his men. "There are rumors that the Avatar is heading for Omashu." Lee frowned and ducked under a branch, wondering why that name had struck such a chord with him. There had been no rush of memories, no faceless voices, just an odd urge to follow, as if it was the Avatar who had been calling him to action all along. No matter how hard he tried, however, he could not connect the pieces to explain the feeling. His mind was a jigsaw puzzle of broken echoes and shadows, and nothing he did could make the segments fit. It was frustrating, but no more than any of the other times he had discovered a gap in his memories that he was unable to fill. Shrugging off the matter, Lee increased his speed and focused only on getting out of the forest. He still had a lot of ground to cover before he reached Omashu, and he could not afford to be distracted with so many Fire Nation soldiers crawling around. Right now, he just had to concentrate on surviving. Oh. It was dark by the time he reached Omashu. He had been surprised to discover a red Fire Nation flag fluttering from the city wall, but he had come too far to let it stop him. Regardless of who was in control, he had to get inside the library and see if he could find something about the path of the ancient ways. The wall did present a problem. It was a huge mass of stone that looked far too smooth to have been crafted with anything but earth bending, nor were there any nearby cliffs or trees to help him ascend. Lee knew that he could just wait until the gate opened to sneak inside, but there was no saying how long that would take. Fortified cities only opened their front gates to welcome in new supplies or visiting officials. Since he was neither, it looked as if his only option was indeed to climb. "There has to be a way," Lee muttered, folding his arms and zeroing in on a more shadowed, secluded part of the wall. If he timed it well, the soldiers guarding the perimeter wouldn't notice if he climbed that section. The question that remained was if he'd be able to scale a wall of this size. He moved closer and ran his hand over the stone. It really was too smooth, no ridges or anything to provide a good enough grip to safely climb a wall of this size. He'd risk breaking his neck if he tried. That was when he remembered the crossbow and rope. He removed one of the bolts from the quiver slung over his shoulder and examined its sturdiness, testing to see if it would be able to pierce through stone and how much weight it could carry without dislodging. The bolt seemed solid enough. His brow creased and he stared back at the wall. His plan was dangerous, very dangerous, but if it worked. Lee tightened his grip on the bolt. He had to try. Removing the rope from his pack, he tied one end to the bolt in a complicated knot and then, after making sure the rope was not going to come loose, slotted the bolt into position on the crossbow. He exhaled deeply and raised the weapon. This time, he could not afford to make mistakes. "Please work," he murmured. He released the catch. The bolt soared through the air and buried itself into the topmost part of the wall. Lee held his breath as he watched the rope uncoil like a snake and dangle against the side of the stone in a thread of silver. His jaw clenched. The rope had stopped just under halfway and would be impossible for him to reach from the ground. Just perfect. Forcing himself to calm, he fixed a new bolt into place and shot the projectile into the stone just within reaching distance. A second followed a little higher up from the first, and then another and another. Sometimes he misjudged his aim, sometimes the arrows ricocheted off the stone, and sometimes he just had to wait so the guards he could see patrolling the wall would not be alerted to his presence from the noise. By the time the quiver was almost empty, he had created a zigzagging-like line of bolts leading to the bottom of the rope, like a ladder without rungs. It wasn't his chosen method of scaling a wall, but it would have to do. Lee tucked away the crossbow, quiver, and his pack into a small alcove near the precipice, which surrounded the city like a giant moat. All three were not exactly heavy, but they were still bulky enough to hinder his maneuverability. Best just to leave them here for now. He could come back to get his belongings later. Though he did remove his water skin from the pack, which he stuffed into his tunic to join the pie-show tile and scrap of parchment. The dagger was safely tucked into his boot. Satisfied that he had everything he needed, he turned to face the wall. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, and jumped to grab the first bolt. The climb was not easy. It took all of his agility and strength to make it up his makeshift line of handholds, especially since his right shoulder kept twinging at inopportune moments and one of the bolts decided to slip free, almost sending him tumbling to the ground. But Lee was not to be deterred. He trusted in his instincts and soon made it to the rope, which he was able to scale much more quickly. He paused when he got close to the top. Soft footsteps alerted him to the fact the guard patrolling the section had come back. He gripped the rope and stuck close to wall, praying the guard would not look down. The seconds felt like hours. Sweat gathered on his brow behind the mask. Wasn't this guy ever going to move? Eventually, the tap of footsteps retreated again. Lee exhaled a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He waited a moment longer before he clambered up the rest of the rope and landed in a crouch on the rampart. No shouts or alarms sounded. So far so good. He quickly untied the rope from the bolt and gathered it into a loop, which he then tied to his belt. It might come in handy again. There was nothing he could do about the bolts, but that was fine. Unless someone looked down from this particular spot on the rampart, they wouldn't even notice the metal spikes jutting out from the stone. Now all he had to do was find the library. Ducking low so as not to be seen, he headed away from the outer wall and towards the main part of the city. A few patrol guards got in his path, but he skirted around them so they wouldn't notice him. His instinct for stealth was really coming in handy. Unfortunately, he had no clue where he was going. More often than not, his mind supplied him with an instinctive map of places. This time he had nothing. It seemed he had not made a habit of visiting Omashu in his past. He would just have to search the old-fashioned way and hope that he could find it before he was discovered by the Fire Nation. So it was that Lee made his way over the rooftops, grateful for the compact nature of the city that allowed him to leap from building to building without any of those patrolling the ground noticing him. He frowned as he wondered why no one else but soldiers seemed to be wandering the streets. Perhaps there was a curfew in place. That would certainly explain the quiet but tense energy that emanated from the city. He was just making his way past some scaffolding when he heard a strange rumbling noise. Turning in alarm, he saw a boy wearing an orange cape knock an avalanche of rocks away with a blast of wind. On the plaza below, two females, one who was holding a baby and a group of soldiers stood watching in surprise. All of them would have been crushed had the boy not stepped in to help. The resistance. The woman holding the baby exclaimed, pointing her finger at the boy. Lee was stunned to see the younger girl in the red dress step forward and fan out her arms, releasing a flurry of small, arrow-like darts. The weapons headed straight for the boy with the staff. With rare grace, he dodged them all and then gestured at something behind him. Only then did Lee notice the other boy and girl, both clad in blue. A frown creased his brow as he watched the guards climb up the ladders to pursue the trio. The blue-clad girl managed to knock some of the guards off with waterbending, but then the same female in red rushed onto the platform with fresh weapons clutched in her hands, already aiming to attack. Perhaps it was the fact that Lee knew Orange Cape had only been trying to help. Perhaps it was simply because he wasn't used to playing spectator. Either way, he found himself jumping down from his perch just as red-clad girl made to unleash another volley of darts. In one quick lunge, he grabbed her wrists and twisted her arms up, making the projectiles shoot harmlessly off to the side. Tawny eyes glared at him as he held her subdued, and for a moment he was struck by the familiarity of her angular, almost cat-like features. Was it possible that he had met this girl before? Before he could ponder the matter further, she slid her foot between his and yanked back hard, shaking his balance. He recovered in an instant, but by then she had already slipped free of his grasp and was firing a hail of knives from the mechanisms tucked in her sleeves. His eyes widened behind the slits of his mask. There wasn't enough time to dodge the attack. She was too close, her weapons too fast. No! Someone yelled. A wall of ice came up between him and the knives. He stepped back in surprise and then a hand latched around his wrist and started tugging. Come on! The waterbender urged. We have to get out of here. Lee didn't argue and followed her to where he could see Orange Cape and the other blue-clad boy fighting the last of the guards. Soon, it was just the four of them on the platform. You! Orange Cape exclaimed, taking a step towards Lee. Is it really? We don't have time for this. The waterbender interjected. That girl with the throwing weapons is still coming after us. As if on cue, a red-tinted knife flashed into view in the corner of Lee's eyes. He reached forward on instinct and pulled Aang out of the way just as the knife embedded itself into the scaffolding directly where he had been standing. That was close, Aang gasped, still leaning against Lee's chest. Lee narrowed his eyes and released the boy's cape. He brought his swords out with a ring of steel. The girl in red was not going to give the trio a chance to escape if she could help it. She was determined, and she was ruthless too. Still, he'd immobilized her once. He could do it again. So he gestured for the three to run and stepped forward to meet his knife-wielding opponent. "No, wait!" Aang exclaimed. Before Lee could respond, the kid rushed forward and brought his staff around in a sweeping curve, creating a gust of wind that surged forth and crashed against the scaffolding to their right. Bits of metal and stone fell down in front of them. Debris and dust quickly blocked the path. Lee thought he might have heard the whirring sound of darts shooting through the air, but he didn't get the chance to warn the others. As he opened his mouth to speak, the ground opened up from underneath them and then they were plunging into the earth. Someone yelped maybe that boy in blue, but Lee was too shocked to even make a sound. It felt like he'd left his stomach back up on the surface. Then his back hit the ground with a thud and he realized the drop had been quite small. A second later someone landed on top of him. All the breath was knocked from his lungs. Groaning, he sat up and saw Aang sprawled on his lap. For a moment they just stared at each other, Lee irritated while the young boy was wide-eyed. Then two scrawny arms wrapped around Lee's chest, pulling him into a tight hug. "It really is you!" Aang exclaimed, still clutching Lee as if his life depended on it. "I was so worried. I didn't know what had happened to you, and then I started hearing rumors that you were dead and I..." A man cleared his throat. Lee would have been amused by how quickly Aang froze upon noticing the four earthbenders, but in that moment he just felt too shaken. It was one thing to sense that there were gaps in his memories, it was quite another to have some random boy hug him and babble on in a bewildering rush of words as if they had always known each other. Even now, Lee could feel his mind throbbing in twinges of pain from the effort of trying to make sense of it all, yet there were no images to help him connect the pieces. He was just lost. Lee barely noticed when Aang got off him, though somehow he found himself back on his feet. Strange. He didn't remember standing up. He rubbed at his temples, trying to ease the headache that scattered his thoughts. He felt so disorientated. Voices echoed around him in a buzz of noise, but he couldn't make out the words. It wasn't until he became aware of an insistent tugging on his sleeve that clarity returned, allowing him to focus on the young boy standing beside him. "You okay?" Aang asked. Lee stared at the arrow tattooed onto his head. "You're the Avatar, aren't you?" Aang blinked. Yeah. And we know each other." "Of course." Aang nudged him in the ribs. "You're the blue spirit." Lee let out a breath that he didn't realize he had been holding. "Right," he said flatly. "The blue spirit." Aang scrunched his face in confusion. "Is this some kind of game or something?" Lee was about to respond when they were interrupted by the blue-clad warrior. "Hey, Aang, I know you're happy to see the blue what's his face again, but Yan says he's not going to wait any longer. We need to keep moving." "Sorry, Sokka," Aang said with a sheepish grin. "We're coming now." He glanced back at Lee. "You are coming with us, right?" Lee nodded. Not that he had much of a choice in the matter. It wasn't as if he could earthbend his way out of the tunnels. Aang beamed in approval and darted ahead to join the waterbender and the four earthbenders. There was a lemur flying in circles above their heads, chittering in a loud, irritable way as if to tell them to hurry up. Lee frowned. He didn't remember seeing the creature earlier. "Hey." Lee glanced back at the warrior. "Sokka, did the Avatar say his name was?" "I know Aang thinks the world of you," Sokka said in a low voice, "but we've had people help us in the past only to turn on us a second later." He leaned forward, pointing a threatening finger at Lee's face. "I've got my eye on you, Blue Mask." Not waiting for a response, Sokka stalked away to join the rest of the group. Lee repressed a sigh before following. In truth, he was not surprised that Sokka had tried to intimidate him. He probably would be just as mistrustful. Still, Lee did have to wonder what he was getting himself into by going with these people. Hugs and now threats? He hated to think what would be next. Chapter 5, A Friendship Forged, A Trust Broken. The Avatar had given a speech to the resistance members about living to fight another day. It was decided that everyone would flee the city using pentapox, though Lee had not understood how that was meant to help anything. The next morning, he finally understood why the waterbender had been so amused by his confusion. Buckets of purple pentape had been collected from the sewers and were used to make the civilians and resistance fighters look as if they had a skin disease. Combined with an old man's coaching on how to act ill, the group were transformed into an army of plague carriers, all of whom moaned and stumbled as they walked while looking as if they were about to die on the spot. It was a genius plan, for not even the Fire Nation had the power to combat an epidemic. The governor would be forced to let them go or risk his people succumbing to the sickness as well. Lee folded his arms and watched the spectacle of the Omasha residents practicing to be ill. He'd declined the offer of having the waterbender Katara, he reminded himself put pentapus marks on him. He didn't need to pretend to be one of the living dead to slip past the soldiers, and he had no desire to remove his mask if he could help it. He had not forgotten Xiao's advice. Besides, he wasn't planning on joining the Great Exodus to escape the city. He had come to Omasha to find information about the path of the ancient ways, and that was what he was going to do. First, however, he needed to discover the location of the Omasha library. He noticed Yan walking past holding a bucket of pentape in his arms. "Wait," Lee said, pushing away from the wall. Yan threw an impatient glance his way. "What is it? Can't you see I'm in a hurry? Can you tell me where to find the library? It's important." "You're wasting your time, kid. The Omasha library has always been part of the palace, and that was razed to the ground when the Fire Nation first took over the city." He took a firmer grip on the bucket, stopping a pentapus from escaping. "I'm sorry, but whatever information you were hoping to find is gone." Something cold settled in the pit of Lee's stomach. Dimly, he was aware of Yan walking away, but everything seemed so insignificant and fuzzy to him in that moment. All he could think was that it had all been for nothing. No one had seemed to know about the path of the ancient ways, and now he had discovered that the library and all of its contents had been destroyed. It was so frustrating, so hopeless. He had been certain that Omasha would give him the answers he sought, but all he had found was another dead end. "Everything okay?" Lee turned and saw the Avatar frowning up at him. The orange turban was once again wrapped around Aang's head, yet Lee noticed there were no pentapus marks on his face or neck. "You're not joining the others," Lee observed. "I see you aren't either." Lee's jaw tightened and he looked towards the city center, staring at the space where the palace used to be and where the governor's house now gleamed in red and black. "It doesn't matter now," he said bitterly. "The knowledge I was searching for no longer exists." Aang hesitated. "You know, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Yan. If it's information you want, I know someone who might be able to help." "Who?" "King Bumi. He can be a little crazy sometimes, but he knows a lot, especially about the Earth Kingdom." Aang gave a shy smile. "I'm going to go look for him now. You could come with me if you like." A crease formed on Lee's brow. There was something familiar about that grin. Something that whispered of a clearing and a boy hugging his knees to his chest as he talked about the past. "If we knew each other back then, do you think we could have been friends?" Lee let out a small breath. Just like that the memory was gone, retreating back behind the walls of his mind that he could never breach. His head lightly throbbed from the effort of trying to piece together his broken past, but he ignored the pain and stared at Aang with a new intensity. The Avatar had said that they had known each other, had hugged him and greeted him as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Was it really possible that they had been friends? "All right," Lee said quietly. "I'll come with you." Aang's grin widened. "Great. With the two of us searching, we should be able to find Bumi in no time." Lee nodded. A commotion from the left had both boys turning to look at the assembled group of residents, all of whom were now suitably spotted and ready to begin the march for escape. "Okay, everyone," Sokka called, taking the lead. Into sick formation. With much groaning and shuffling, the residents formed a pack and started making the slow trek for the gates. Lee and Aang exchanged a glance of silent agreement and headed in the opposite direction. Aang! Katara exclaimed, running towards them. What are you doing? Aren't you coming with us? Aang shook his head. I'm not leaving until I find Bumi. Momo leapt onto Aang's shoulder and chittered, grabbing his mouth. Sorry, Momo, Aang said, picking up the lemur and handing him back to Katara. I'll feed you later. Momo's ears drooped. Katara glanced up at Lee and he could see the undisguised worry in her eyes. You've always been there to help Aang in the past, she said, meeting his gaze through the slits of his mask. Please protect him now. Lee gave a slight nod. I will. I can take care of myself, you know, Aang complained, looking somehow disgruntled yet at the same time pleased that she was showing so much concern for him. I know, she said, but I'll just feel better if the blue spirit is keeping an eye on you too. Her lips curved. You have to admit that you do have a habit of getting yourself into dangerous situations. Aang rubbed the back of his neck and gave a sheepish grin. It seemed that even he couldn't argue with that. We need to go, Lee stated flatly, turning his back on them. It'll be easier to find King Bumi while the Fire Nation soldiers are distracted. You're right, Aang agreed. Saying his last goodbyes to Katara, Aang then used airbending to propel Lee, along with himself, to the rooftops. Lee landed in a half-crouch and got to his feet to survey their surroundings. Not far below, he could see the residents of Omashu moving in a swarm of brown and green, filling up the narrow streets. Shouts of plague echoed throughout the city as the watchmen became aware of the situation. It would not be long before the alarm was sounded. They'll be keeping Bumi somewhere where he can't earthbend, Aang said, coming to stand beside Lee. Got any ideas? Lee shook his head. I don't think I came to Omashu very often. Your guess is as good as mine. A slight crease formed on Aang's brow. Right, he said slowly. Well, I guess we'll just have to take our chances then. He flashed Lee an ear-splitting grin. Think you can keep up? Lee rolled his eyes. Just get moving, Avatar. Yes, sir. Aang bounded ahead, seeming to float rather than jump from one rooftop to the next. Lee followed with much less grace, but his strength and agility made up for his inability to bend the air currents into carrying him across the gaps. The blue spirit had made his home in the shadows. Jumping over rooftops had never been a problem for him, just as he had no trouble keeping pace now. It's just like old times, huh? Aang said with a laugh as they ran side by side. Yeah, Lee said with a sinking feeling in his stomach. Just like old times. Except he had no memory of those times. He was a walking blank, a boy whose slate of identity had been wiped clean with a careless hand, leaving only blurred splotches of the truth. But here was someone who had known him, someone who could tell him about the past if he was willing to trust him. Frowning, Lee slowed to a walk. Hey, Aang, he said, testing out the Avatar's name on his tongue for the first time. Aang stopped in his tracks. Yeah. Lee opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again. Nothing, he said, walking ahead. It's nothing. Let's just keep searching. Aang didn't move. You know, you've been acting kind of weird ever since you joined us yesterday. Are you sure everything is okay? Why would you think it isn't? Gee, I don't know. Maybe because you almost died. Aang took a step towards him. I know things haven't always been easy between us, but you're here now and you're actually helping me again, so I'm guessing something must have happened to change your mind about a few things. Lee sighed and looked the other way. That's the problem. I don't remember what happened. What? One day I woke up in a healer's house, Lee confided, knowing he could no longer keep the truth to himself. I didn't know who I was or where I had come from. The girl who had been helping to take care of me said I hadn't spoken a word for 2 days. I wouldn't even move unless someone made me. He turned to meet Aang's horrified gaze. Shock, the healer called it. Apparently, my body and mind had suffered too much pain at once. I was as good as dead, but somehow I snapped out of it. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to regain my memories. But you're better now, right? Aang exclaimed, looking rather pale. I mean, You remember me? Lee shook his head. I've managed to piece together some things, but most of it is just fragments. The only thing I know for certain is that I'm the Blue Spirit. His voice took on a wistful tone. I don't even know my real name. I've just been calling myself Lee because that's what Faye and her family took to calling me during the time I couldn't speak. Aang stared down at his hands, mesmerized by the way his thumbs circled each other. So you don't remember anything about me or the time we spent together? I remember a clearing of trees and a boy talking about the world he used to know. Lee's mouth curved into a half-smile, though it was covered by the permanent grin etched onto his mask. I also remember an offer of friendship. Aang let out a small breath. That's it, huh? His voice sounded oddly shaky, as if he was trying not to laugh. Or cry. That's it. For a moment, Aang was silent. Round and round went his thumbs, becoming more frantic with every second. Finally, he dropped his hands to his sides and raised his head. His cheeks were pale, but his expression was determined. I can't tell you who you are, he said, not quite meeting Lee's eyes, but I can tell you this. You saved my life once, even though we weren't allies at the time, and it would have been easier for you to just let me die. I'll never forget that. Their eyes met. You're a good person, Lee. No matter what anyone else tells you, I hope you'll remember that. Lee's eyes narrowed. There's something you're not telling me, isn't there? Aang swallowed and tried again. It's complicated. Let's just say I think it'll be safer for everyone if you keep that mask on. I think I understand. Aang blinked in surprise. You do? Qiao told me the same thing just before I left the town to come here. She said it was better to have people chase a shadow than my real self. And what do you believe? I don't think I have much of a choice. There are a lot of things I don't know about myself. Until I know who I really am, I can't take the risk of being recognized as anyone but the Blue Spirit, even by those I want to trust. His voice softened. I've put enough people in danger. Aang opened his mouth to respond when a loud clanging had them both looking towards the watchtowers. Looks like the alarm has been sounded, Lee observed. Your friends must have made it to the main plaza. We'd better hurry. He dashed ahead, but Aang remained where he was. What's wrong? Lee asked. Aang let out a small breath. Nothing. I just hope Katara and Sokka are alright, that's all. I'm sure they're fine. Now hurry, otherwise we'll be the ones in trouble. Right. Sorry. Lee rolled his eyes. Somehow, he got the feeling that he was often frustrated with this kid. He didn't know why the thought made him think of frozen frogs. Hey, Aang said, pointing to the alley below them. I think I see someone I recognize. Who? Flopsy. Who? Lee repeated, wondering if he had misheard the boy. Aang merely grinned. Come on, I think we just found our ticket to King Bumi. Oh. There were bonfires everywhere. Katara thought the scene would have been quite beautiful, especially with the way the moon and the stars lit up the sky in a brilliant display of silver, but Aang and the Blue Spirit had still not returned. She was worried. It had been hours since she had said goodbye to the two, and she hated to think that something might have happened to them. What if they had been caught trying to leave the city? What if one of them was hurt or... But no. The Blue Spirit could heal, so even if one of them did get injured, they would be okay. Besides, the Blue Spirit had said that he would keep an eye on Aang, and she knew Aang was no pushover either. She had to trust that they would both return to her safely. I know they will, she murmured. Huh. Katara glanced to the side to see Sokka quirking an eyebrow at her. Just thinking aloud, she explained. Sokka rubbed his chin and looked out into the distance to where Omashu lay behind the cover of the mountains. I don't like that Aang went with that Blue Spirit guy, he said after a moment. We don't know anything about him. We don't even know if we can trust him. Sokka, he saved Aang's life. I'm sure he's not about to turn around and try to have Aang killed. Yeah, and Jet helped us to fight off those Fire Nation soldiers as well. Remember what happened with him? Katara stared at her brother with an unimpressed expression. Look, he said, holding his hands up in an appeasing gesture, all I'm saying is that we've been wrong about people's intentions before. Who's to say that this blue spirit guy doesn't have his own agenda as well? Katara folded her arms. His intentions looked pretty clear to me when he stopped that Fire Nation girl from stabbing me in the back. And I'm grateful to him for that, but think about it, Katara. What do we really know about this guy? Katara closed her fingers around her necklace and watched the flames dance before her in flickers of orange and red. I know that he's a healer and a waterbender. I know that he risked his life to save Aang and that he's wanted by the Fire Nation. I know that he helped us last night and has continued to help us since then. She shrugged. Seems like a lot of good reasons to trust him, don't you think? Well, I don't like him, Sokka said mulishly. He doesn't even talk to us, just stands in the shadows and stares at everyone. It's creepy, and that mask of his is creepy too. He's probably just shy. Aang said that the blue spirit prefers to work alone. I guess he's not used to being around so many people. He certainly looked uncomfortable when I was talking to him last night. She didn't mention that she had been surprised at the familiarity of his voice when he had first responded aloud to her. That for a moment, just a tiny moment, she had felt doubt and fear because only one person had spoken to her in such a raspy tone. I'll save you from the pirates. Katara shook her head, brushing aside the memory as easily as a cobweb. The blue spirit had nothing in common with the temperamental prince she had helped to heal in the North Pole. At least not where it mattered. Their voices might be similar, but the blue spirit was composed and quiet, if a little abrupt at times. Zuko was loud and had exploded at every little thing. There could not have been two more different people. As such, she did not find it difficult to dismiss her brother's suspicions. Honestly, Sokka, I think you're just being paranoid. You didn't want to trust Aang when we first met him either, and he's the Avatar. I don't think the blue spirit is trying to trick us. In fact, She broke off as she caught sight of two figures walking towards the camp, one of whom stood out for the blue mask covering his face. Behind them was a large creature with big, floppy ears. Is that Flopsy? Sokka asked, following the direction of her gaze and standing up to get a better look. I don't know, but that's definitely Aang and the blue spirit. Come on. They ran to greet their friend, who just sighed and allowed his shoulders to droop a little more. We looked everywhere, Aang said miserably. No Bumi. Katara pulled him into a hug, trying to give him comfort where words could not. Sokka did the same for Flopsy, who was looking just as dispirited and making pining noises for his master. They can't make a king disappear, the blue spirit said with just the slightest hint of frustration. If they're keeping him somewhere within the city, we will find him. I've already offered to go back later tonight to see what information I can find in the governor's home. If that fails, I'll try the soldiers' barracks. Don't you think that's dangerous? Katara asked, releasing Aang to stare at him. I'm good at sneaking, he said with a shrug. I'll be fine. But don't worry, Katara, Aang said with a reassuring smile. He knows what he's doing. I even said I'd go with him, but he told me I'd just get in the way. That's because you wouldn't know stealth even if it hit you in the head, the blue spirit said bluntly. To be honest, I expected more from an airbender. Sokka placed a hand over his mouth, clearly trying not to laugh. Even Katara had to repress a grin. Hey, it's not like we got caught. Aang defended, looking a bit red around the ears. And I'll have you know that the monks always told me I was very light on my feet. Just not so good at keeping your mouth shut, his tormentor responded. Aang was about to make a retort when Yan interrupted them by clearing his throat. Katara noticed that the blue spirit alone was not surprised to see the older man. Perhaps he had heard the resistance leader coming. She wouldn't put it past him, the masked warrior always seemed to be on alert despite his relatively calm disposition. We've got a problem, Yan said by way of greeting. We just did a head count. Oh, no. Katara exclaimed. Did someone get left behind? No. Yan gestured to the right. We have an extra. All four turned to look to where he had pointed. A group of Omasha residents sat huddled around a fire, but it was the winged lemur that caught her eye. Or, rather, the black-tufted baby who was clinging to the lemur's neck and who was being dragged around in circles as a terrified Momo tried to escape from its clutches. How did a baby get all the way out here? Sokka asked, tilting his head in confusion. Momo screeched and flapped his wings, levitating himself and the baby several meters from the ground. As he passed over the group, the baby lost its grip and fell straight for the blue spirit, who reached out and caught the giggling bundle easily. Apparently, falling was not a new experience to the little boy. Well, I guess that tells us how the baby got here, Aang commented. Momo must have carried him out of the city by accident. He narrowed his eyes at the lemur, who had perched himself on Sokka's head. You were stealing food again, weren't you? Momo chittered something that might have been a declaration of his innocence. Sorry, buddy, Sokka said, reaching up to scratch the lemur behind the ears, but I don't think anyone is buying that. Katara laughed and glanced back at the blue spirit, who was now fending off the baby's attempts to grab his mask. I think he likes you, she teased. That's cute, Yan said in a tone that suggested he thought quite the opposite, but you're missing the point. This is a Fire Nation child, and not just anyone at that. What do you mean? Katara asked, stepping forward to get a closer look at the baby. Look at his clothes, the blue spirit said softly. They've been made with the finest silk. Whoever this child belongs to, it has to be someone important. Yan folded his arms. Exactly, and eventually his parents are going to notice that their pride and joy is missing. You think they'll come after us? Aang asked. I don't know, but either way the rest of us will be leaving tomorrow morning. It's too risky for us to stay in the mountain ranges with Omasha so close. I'd avoid the northern exit if I were you, the blue spirit said, capturing both of the baby's hands with one of his own to stop the relentless assault on his mask. The last time I passed through that way there was a Fire Nation blockade set up. We ran into that too, Sokka said. There were a lot of fireballs. Though I have to admit, if I had known what was waiting for me in the secret love tunnel, I think I might have just risked the fireballs. Katara clenched her hands into fists. Aren't you forgetting something? She pointed a finger at the baby. What are we supposed to do about him? We could always get Momo to fly him back to the city, Aang suggested. Are you kidding? She exclaimed. The last time I tried to get Momo to fetch me some water, he brought me a dead mouse and a crown, not to mention all the other junk he found. I think it's safe to say that using the lemur transportation service is not an option. The blue spirit held the baby away from him, tilting his head from side to side as he examined the little boy. It's too bad we don't know who his parents are. I could have just dropped him off at their house when I returned to the city later. Well, we don't know, Katara responded, and I'm still not sure if going back is such a good idea. Besides, how would you have found the right house? He shrugged. My point exactly. The blue spirit leaned over and whispered something in Aang's ear. Katara watched as Aang chuckled and nodded. Oh, you have no idea, Aang commented. No idea about what? Katara demanded suspiciously. What are you two talking about? Sokka grinned. I think I know. Blueface over there has just noticed how bossy you can arg. He glared at his sister, who had just hit him on the head, and sent Momo screeching for a new perch. What was that for? They're the ones who said it. Is this true, Aang? She asked, rounding on him. Do you really think I'm bossy? Aang blushed. I only meant that you can be a bit, forceful with your... Oh, forget it. She snapped, then stomped over to where the blue spirit was standing and snatched the baby from his hands. Do what you want, but I won't let you drag this child into it. He's just a baby. A Fire Nation baby, Yan reminded her, and one who is currently putting all of us in danger. Katara narrowed her eyes, daring the resistance leader to take the baby from her. Yan did not dare. Instead, he muttered something about checking on the other residents before moving to one of the campfires down the mountain path. Satisfied, Katara returned her attention to the boy in her arms. Don't worry, she cooed, enfolding him in a hug. I won't let them hurt you. Sokka rolled his eyes. She acts like we're going to put him on a spit and roast him. Katara glared at her brother. I heard that. Hey, it was just an observation. He held up his hands. You have to admit that you are being a little unreasonable right now. I admit to nothing of the sort. She wrinkled her nose. Though I do think our new friend might have soiled his nappy. Sokka, can you grab my pack? I have some clean rags in there. I'll do it. Aang cried, and shot off towards Appa in a blur of orange. A few seconds later he had returned and was dropping the bag at her feet. Thanks, she said with a smile. Carefully, she placed the baby down on his back and then pulled off his pants and the soiled cloth that had been tied at his waist to stop anything from leaking. Sokka scrunched his nose. Ugh, I think this is my cue to leave. Coward, his sister taunted. A warrior knows when to fight and when to retreat, Sokka said with all the dignity of a great chief. Then he clamped a hand over his nose and mouth. This is a time to retreat. Katara pursed her lips as she watched her brother flee to another campfire. What about you two? She asked, turning to look at Aang and the blue spirit. Are you going to run as well? Aang paused mid-step from where he had been trying to creep away. Of course not, he said, straightening to his full height and laughing nervously. Then he paled. Why? Do you need any help? She couldn't stop the smile that came to her lips. Some more water would be nice. I need to clean him before I can replace the nappy. Right. Aang shot off again to look for water. It suddenly got very quiet around the campfire. Only the crackling of the fire and the baby's happy gurgles could be heard. Katara picked up the boy and held him out from her so that he couldn't wriggle away. Those stumpy legs of his were surprisingly mobile and were apt to take their owner off without warning. Sighing, she stared at the masked warrior who was standing not far from her, looking as still and silent as a human statue. I'm not really bossy, you know, she said a little defensively. The blue spirit turned to look down at her, his mask glinting with the reddish glow of the campfire. Instead of saying anything, he just nodded as if to say that he understood. The lack of a verbal response made it feel like he wasn't convinced. Really, I'm not, she insisted. You're just worried and want to make sure everyone is okay, he finished for her. I get it. Katara was quiet for a moment. You know, you never did tell me your name. He shrugged. I'm the blue spirit. A wry smile curved her lips. Is that really your name? He turned his back to her. For a moment she thought he would never answer and that maybe she had crossed a line or been too pushy. Lee, he said softly. My name is Lee. Katara's smile widened a fraction. Lee, she repeated. I'll remember that. His swift glance had her once more looking at the demonic grin that covered his face. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking, for even his eyes were shadowed to the point of being unrecognizable. Still, the fact that she couldn't see his features didn't bother her as it once might have done. The important thing was that he was here. The important thing was that he was safe. And maybe, just maybe, he would stick around to stay with them this time. She hoped so. It would be nice to have another healer around. Oh. Lee was just about to resume his search for Bumi when the messenger hawk arrived. The note turned out to be from the Fire Nation governor, who had accused them of kidnapping his son, Tom Tom. Desperate, the governor had then offered a trade, his son for King Bumi. It was a deal that Lee and the others could not ignore, even if Sokka insisted that there had to be a catch. You're just being pessimistic, Katara retorted. I don't see why the governor wouldn't want to trade King Bumi for his son. Clearly, he just understands the importance of family. The message does seem sincere, Lee allowed, but we should still be cautious. Sokka is right, this could be a trap. I don't think so, Aang said quietly. I'm sure the governor wants his son back just as much as we want Bumi. I have a good feeling about this. Katara smiled at Lee. Well, I guess this means you won't have to go back to the city tonight. I suppose, he said without enthusiasm. Waiting until tomorrow to make the trade just meant more hours of hoping that Aang was right and that Bumi would be able to give him the information that he needed. Lee didn't know what he would do if it turned out that the king was just another dead end. Somehow, he didn't think that a Paisho tile, a dagger, a scrap of parchment and his own fragmented memories were going to get him very far in discovering the truth about his identity. He needed something more solid. He needed to know about the path of the ancient ways. Lee repressed a sigh and stared at the flames dancing in a swirl of heat in front of him. It was soothing in a way, and he slowly began to relax, letting the fire melt away all his fears and frustrations. He was so absorbed in his own thoughts that he barely noticed when Aang got up to tend to Appa. Then he caught sight of something blue flashing out of the corner of his eye. He raised his head and stared at the moon-shaped pendant hanging from Katara's throat, which baby Tom Tom was now trying to grab. "That necklace," Lee murmured. "Where did you get it?" "It was my mother's," Katara explained, touching the pale stone. "She died in a Fire Nation raid when I was young. I've worn it ever since." "I'm sorry," he said, feeling his own heart clench in inexplicable pain at the thought of losing a mother. "I just thought I recognized it, that's all." Sokka looked up in interest from where he had been sharpening his boomerang. "That's a traditional Water Tribe necklace. The only way you could have seen one is if you've been to the Northern Water Tribe." Lee said nothing. It wasn't as if he could remember if he'd ever spent time in the North Pole. Katara shifted closer to Lee. There was a gleam of suppressed excitement in her eyes, as if he had just confirmed something to her. "Aang told us about how you lost your memories when you got hurt. Maybe you recognize the necklace because it's part of your heritage too." His heart thudded against his ribs. "What are you talking about?" "Lee, you didn't just save Aang's life. You healed him with bending." A warm smile touched her lips. "Don't you see? You're a waterbender." "That's not possible," he said flatly. "I'm a non-bender. I've always just used swords." "Then how did you heal Aang?" she persisted. He noticed that she was still smiling. Lee shook his head. "I think I would know if I could bend. I've been around plenty of water and none of it wanted to do my bidding. Maybe you weren't trying hard enough. Here." She put Tom Tom down on the ground and then bent the contents of her water skin into a nearby bucket, which she held out to him. "Try to move the water." Lee stared at the unmoving liquid. He felt no connection with it, nothing to suggest that he could bend it to his will. But if Katara was right, if he really was a waterbender. He let out a deep breath and placed his hand over the water, concentrating on just a small section of the transparent surface. "Move," he willed in his mind. "Move, damn it." "Keep trying," Katara encouraged when nothing happened, "but don't try to force it. Waterbending is about working with your element, a constant push and pull, like the tides created by the different phases of the moon. Let the energy flow between you and the water. It will reach out to you." He nodded and searched within himself, calling upon the energy that flowed through his chi paths. It was strange, for while he could indeed sense some kind of power buried deep inside his body, it was almost as if the pathways that led to that energy had been sealed off. Frustrated, he pushed against the barriers with his consciousness, trying to force a hole for the energy to slip through. The campfire sparked with a new intensity, and he was vaguely aware of Sokka leaning forward to get a better look at the bucket, but not a ripple disturbed the surface of the water. "Come on." Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. "If I really am a waterbender, then why won't you move?" "What's going on?" Aang asked. "Katara told Lee that she thinks he's a waterbender," Sokka explained. "Now she's trying to teach him how to bend, as it looks as if he forgot how to do it when he lost his memories. Can't say I'm complaining. I get drenched enough with just the two of you around." Aang chewed on his bottom lip. "Oh." His gaze flickered to Lee and then off to the side, as if he couldn't bear to look at him. "Well, I just remembered that I have to do something so." He left quickly, not even bothering to finish his explanation. Sokka exchanged a glance with his sister. That was weird. Lee didn't hear what Katara said in response. With one ruthless push he had finally managed to create a hole in the seals blocking his chi. His head faintly pulsed from the effort and the water still had not moved, but for a moment he could feel the warmth and power waiting to be unleashed. He could feel his energy. Then something snapped inside him, like a string pulled too hard. Daggers of pain sliced through the tender shell of his mind and it was as if a vice was closing in on his consciousness. Gasping, he pushed the bucket away from him and placed his head in his hands, trying to ease his sudden dizziness. "Lee, what's wrong?" Katara asked, hovering anxiously at his side. "Just give me a moment," he grunted. Breathing deeply, he closed his eyes and allowed his body to relax. The painful pulsing in his head began to fade, along with the black dots swimming before his eyes. Once he was sure that he wasn't going to faint, he raised his head and looked at them. So? Sokka prompted. What went wrong? Lee shrugged. I don't know. It's like whatever is stopping me from remembering my past has blocked my chi as well. He shifted his gaze to Katara. Even if you're right that I'm a waterbender, I don't think I'll be bending anytime soon. She lowered her head. I'm sorry, Lee. I didn't know it would hurt you like that. I shouldn't have been so pushy. He dismissed her apology with a wave of his hand. Forget about it. You were only trying to help. Besides, he tapped the hilts sticking out from the sheath strapped to his back, I still have my swords. As long as he had those, it didn't matter if he could bend or not. Though he did have to wonder about one thing, if he really was a waterbender, why did none of his memories as the blue spirit involve him using anything but swords to fight? And if he wasn't a bender, what was all that power he had felt buried inside him? He didn't understand, but one day he would, of that he was certain. At the very least, his journey to Omasha had not been a complete waste. Chiao had told him that he might find someone who knew him in the city, and so he had. He'd found the Avatar. That had to count for something. If we knew each other back then, do you think we could have been friends? The faintest of smiles tugged at Lee's mouth. Maybe it was fate that they should have met again. He'd always felt an inexplicable connection with the Avatar, and now he knew why. He'd saved the kid's life. Maybe, just maybe, it was Aang who would help Lee to regain his. Oh. Most of the people gathered around the campfires had already fallen asleep. Aang sat huddled against Appa, hugging his knees to chest as he tried to ignore the fingers of guilt twisting his stomach into knots. He'd lied. He'd lied again, and he knew in his heart that what he had done was so wrong, so selfish. He'd just been so afraid. He'd just wanted his friend back. Somehow, he'd even managed to convince himself that it was fate the boy with the scar should have lost his memories and that it was okay to lie, because it would all work out in the end. It had been upsetting, of course, but then how many times had Aang wished that the two of them could start again, free from those bitter memories of the North Pole? This was his chance to make things right, to fix a past that had gone so horribly wrong. Or at least that was what Aang had told himself. Deep down, he knew that it was fear that kept him silent. He just couldn't bear to see those golden eyes burn with hate. Not again. Not after so many weeks of worry and despair. So Aang had kept the truth to himself. He had lied. But then he had seen Katara trying to teach Lee how to waterbend and he'd just felt sick to his stomach. He should have spoken out then. He hated himself for staying silent. I'm sorry, Zuko, Aang whispered. I'm so sorry. Because even though he knew it was wrong and selfish, he also knew that it was so much easier to create new strands for his web of lies than to confess what he had done. He was just so afraid. He just wanted his friend back. Chapter 6, Echoes of the Past. Everything had went wrong very quickly during the trade for King Bumi. It had all started with one person as well, Princess Azula. What's wrong with him? Lee heard someone mutter, but the voice seemed so far away, like a whisper carried on the wind. I don't know, but he won't stop shaking. Can't you do something to help him? I already tried, but that girl in pink did something to my bending. I can't do a thing. Well, at least we got him away from that crazy one with the blue fire. I just hope that Aang and Bumi are alright. The girl said something in response, but Lee could barely distinguish the words. The world was fading in and out, drawing him back into the darkness. No, into the fire. He was wreathed in flames, sinking deeper into a tunnel of burning gold that wrapped itself around him like a web. There was no escape, no release. He was falling just like he had done when lightning had pierced into his shoulder, sending shockwaves of white-hot energy throughout his body and squeezing at his heart. This time, however, there was no ocean to greet him. There was only fire. You'll never catch up. The words were a whisper, a threat. It seemed important to remember this, but it was as if his thoughts had lost their anchor and were now drifting off in whatever direction the current took them, slipping from his grasp as fast as he clutched at them. He couldn't hold on to the memories any longer. As the flames dragged him deeper into unconsciousness, he saw an image of a girl with the amber eyes looming over him like some dark goddess painted across the skies, watching him as he fell. She was smiling. Oh. The room was swathed in red and gold. Angela stared at her reflection, meeting the amber eyes that stared back at her. Eyes that were just like her mother's. Even their lips were the same, but the expression that curved her mouth had always been sharper, more calculating. It was Zuko who had got all of Ursa's softness, Zuko who had always needed to be reassured and loved and who was so sensitive to other people's pain, even the stupid turtle ducks that he and their mother had used to feed together. Angela gritted her teeth and clenched her hands into fists on the dresser so that her knuckles flared white. It was his own fault that she had killed him. He should never have resisted her. He should have realized that he was completely outclassed, but Zuko had always been stubborn, idiot that he was. So she had decided to put him in his place once and for all. She had wanted to remind him why their father had always called her the only fire-bending prodigy in the family. No one had ever mastered lightning so quickly. She knew Zuko would be impressed when he saw the technique, but ever since she had seen him fall over the side of the ship, there were moments where she wondered if she had ever really meant to hurt him that much. He had screamed so loud, and the way he had just crumpled like a paper figure crushed in her fist had seemed strangely jarring to her in her moment of triumph. Zuko had always been weak, but never that weak. Never that fragile. It was his own fault, she repeated. But the whispers in her mind kept repeating monster over and over, because in her heart she had known that Zuko would not have been able to block the lightning. And she never made mistakes. Did she? Angela's expression hardened. So what if I killed him? She muttered, glaring at her reflection at any scrap of Ursa that she could see upon the mirrored surface. It was what father had been hoping for when he first banished Zuko. Everyone knew the truth. Everyone except my idiot of a brother. Father had always wanted me to be the heir apparent, and now I am. Her mouth curved into a cruel smile. Now I am. She had no reason to regret her actions. Zuko was probably better off where he was and. Not one more step. Angela's smile vanished. That masked swordsman had sounded just like Zuko. For a moment she had even thought it was her brother trying to block her from the Avatar, but the way he had moved was all wrong, and even though she was aware that Zuko had been interested in weapons as a child, she'd never seen him wield dual Deo blades. Nor did she think that her brother would ally himself with the Avatar, especially not after spending 3 years searching and failing to capture the boy. No, there was no way that the masked swordsman could be Zuko. Her brother had been killed that day on the ship. But that didn't change the fact that there had just been something so familiar about the warrior. It was a feeling that reached deep into her soul, as if he were an echo of some intrinsic part of her identity that had been lost a long time ago. It's okay to be scared, Angela. I'm not scared. I just can't sleep with all of this stupid thunder making so much noise, and if I have to stay awake then so do you. The young boy smiled and wrapped his arm around her, pulling her into a loose embrace. She thought about pushing him away, because she wasn't afraid and didn't need to be babied, but the lightning was so bright and the explosions of thunder almost sounded like an army of firebenders storming the palace. Before she knew it, she was leaning in closer to his body, taking comfort in his solid warmth. I'm not scared, she repeated fiercely. I know, he murmured, resting his head against hers so that she could feel the smoothness of his left cheek brushing against her skin. I just figured you might be cold. She hid her face against his shoulder so that he would not see her small grin. Sometimes, she really liked her brother when he wasn't acting like such a big dum-dum. Angela blinked, allowing the memory to fade back into the recesses of her mind. Suddenly, it was not her mother that she could see staring out from her reflection, but Zuko's face, unscarred and handsome, just as it had been before his banishment. Before she had been left alone. Her eyes narrowed. So, brother, you think to haunt me as this blue spirit, do you? She'd heard stories about certain spirits entering the physical world to seek revenge for those who had been unjustly killed. It would be just like the spirits to take pity on her weakling brother. Precious little Zuzu who could never do anything right but whom everyone seemed to love, even with all of his imperfections. Still, that didn't explain why the masked warrior had fallen apart like that in front of her, as if he had started having some kind of fit. Spirits wouldn't do that, would they? Angela was still pondering this problem when someone knocked at the door. "Enter," she said sharply. There was the sound of a handle being turned and she watched on the reflective surface of the mirror as Mai and Tai Li advanced into the room. She turned to face the two girls, her expression cold. "Well." Mai bowed her head. "No sign of them, Princess Angela. The Avatar and his friends have definitely escaped the city, however, they seem to have left King Bumi behind." "Yeah, it was really strange," Tai Li said, pressing her finger to her cheek. "We found him on the high platform just waiting for us to raise him back up on the chain." "It could be worth investigating further," Mai observed. "It does seem odd that the Avatar and his friends would waste their time trying to rescue the king only to then leave him." "Forget about the old man," Angela said impatiently. "Whatever the Avatar was wanting from King Bumi, he got it. You can be assured of that. Besides, we have much more important matters to settle." Tai Li grinned. "We're going to track down your uncle, right? It's not just Iroh now." Angela's expression hardened. "We have a second target. And this time she would not let the Avatar slip through her grasp. Blue spirit or not, the last airbender would be hers to claim." Oh. It was quiet inside the tent. Aang sat with Momo huddled on his lap, just staring at the boy lying unconscious on Katara's sleeping pallet. The blue spirit mask was still covering Zuko's face, no thanks to Katara, who had been ready to remove it before Aang had stopped her with much arm-waving and exclamations, but that didn't bother Aang. He was just glad that Zuko was no longer shaking. He was just glad to hear the soft inhale and exhale of Zuko's breathing, because there was no denying that something had gone terribly wrong. The worst part was that no one seemed to know how to fix it either. "Don't worry, Momo," Aang murmured, giving the lemur an absent pat. "I haven't started getting those weird feelings yet, so whatever is wrong with him can't be that bad, right?" Momo gazed up at Aang with big green eyes and then started licking his paw. Aang sighed and shifted his attention back to Zuko, or Lee as he was supposed to call him now. The thought still made his stomach twist with guilt. Sometimes, he wondered if it was his fault that Zuko was in this mess. Those girls had been Fire Nation after all, and it was only when Zuko had tried to confront that bender with the blue fire that he'd started to show any real signs of distress. "Perhaps I should have told you the truth," Aang said. "It would have been easier then, back when you first told me about your amnesia. I just didn't know what would happen if I did." He swallowed, conscious of the painful lump in his throat. "I didn't want you to hate me again." "Hate you for what?" Aang jumped at the sound of the new voice. He spun around to see Katara watching him with a frown. He hadn't even heard her enter the tent. "And nothing," he stammered. "I was just, I thought the blue spirit was your friend. He saved your life twice, in fact. Why would he hate you?" Aang lowered his head. "It's complicated." "You mean you don't want to talk about it?" she observed shrewdly. He flinched a little but remained silent. He knew it was true. Katara folded her arms across her chest. "Well, I just hope you know what you're doing. Gran always told me that keeping a secret from someone is like walking over thin ice, eventually it's going to crack. If there is something that you've been hiding from Lee, perhaps you should tell him before it gets any more out of hand. At the very least, it might help him remember something about his past." "I know," Aang said softly. He sighed and shook his head. Never mind. Because there was no way that Katara could understand his predicament. She thought he was keeping secrets from Lee, the masked waterbender turned swordsman. She had no idea it was Zuko under the mask, no idea that the boy she had been trying to help was the same as the one she had grudgingly healed in the North Pole all of those weeks ago. Aang didn't like to dwell on the fact that the only reason she remained ignorant of this knowledge was because he had not been able to bring himself to tell the truth when she had first asked about the blue spirit's identity. "Has your bending returned yet?" he asked, deciding to change the subject. Katara nodded. "I was going to try healing Lee now. I don't know how much good I'll be, since his condition seems to be more mental than physical, but I still might be able to get him to wake up." "Well, you won't know until you try, right?" Aang gathered Momo into his arms and moved aside, giving her more space for bending. "Let's do this." Wordlessly, Katara took her place beside him and then summoned her element from the water skin hanging at her waist. Aang watched with interest as she placed her glowing hands on either side of Zuko's head, searching for his meridian paths to check for any sign of chi knots. In his mind, Aang could almost envision the water slipping through to merge with the fiery colors of Zuko's energy, blending in a swirl of gold and healing blue. But then Katara pulled back and the image he had been creating shattered as he saw the expression on her face. She looked terrified. "What's wrong?" he asked, feeling his chest tighten in panic. "Can you heal him?" Katara guided the liquid surrounding her hands back into her water skin. "I can't reach him." "What?" Her eyes met his, wide and filled with fear. "It's like there's this thick wall surrounding his mind and it's not letting anything through. Everything has been blocked." Aang's brow creased into a frown. "Do you think that's why he's been having so much trouble remembering his past?" "Maybe," she said softly, glancing down at Zuko. "But you want to know the scary thing?" "What?" "When I came up against that wall, it didn't feel like I was hitting just any old barrier." Her gaze locked with his. "It felt like fire." Aang swallowed, conscious of the way his mouth had gone dry. "What do you think it means?" he asked, almost dreading her answer. "I don't know." She stared back at Zuko, and this time he could see the concern hidden amongst the fear in her eyes. "I really don't know, but I don't like it." Aang stared at the mask that covered the scarred features of the Fire Nation prince. He thought he could guess why Zuko's mind felt like it was surrounded by a wall of fire. What he didn't understand was whether the barrier was of Zuko's creation or something much more sinister. "What happened to you, Zuko?" Aang wanted to speak the words aloud, to beg the prince for answers, if only to ease the sick worry building in his chest. But he couldn't. He couldn't do anything, because Zuko only knew of himself as Lee, a non-bender or possible waterbender, and Katara was still there kneeling next to him, listening to every breath, every possible word. It was so frustrating, so distressing. More than that, though, was the ever-increasing knife of guilt being pushed deeper into his stomach. Because now Aang understood that Katara's Gran had been right. Keeping secrets was like walking on thin ice, and the surface under his feet was already cracking. Oh! There was no one in the tent when Lee awoke, a half-strangled scream choking his throat and his body covered in cold sweat. His heart was still pounding from whatever had jolted him awake, but he couldn't remember his dream now. Just that it had been dark and disturbing and filled with so much fire. So much pain. He exhaled shakily and went to rub his face, only to feel his fingers collide with the painted wood of his mask. The temptation to rip it off was overwhelming. Ever since he had become the Avatar's ally, he barely got the chance to remove the disguise unless he excused himself to eat, and even then he was wary. Right now he wanted nothing more than to wrench the mask off his face and toss it away. The heat combined with the pulsing, repetitive stab of pain being tattooed into his skull was all just too much. He needed air. He needed to breathe. But he couldn't remove the mask. Not now. Not when he finally understood the reason for it. Lee allowed his fingers to slip away from the wooden edges and then he buried his face, mask, and all, into his knees. He wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, his chest seemed to constrict with all of his pain, all of his despair, to the point where he felt as if his ribs were splintering inside of him. Now he knew why his memories had always been tinged with fire. Now he knew why people had stared at him oddly before he had hidden his features behind the cover of his blue spirit disguise. He has the eyes. Lee curled his hands into fists, digging his fingers into the coarse fabric of his tunic. He didn't need to remove the mask to know what he would see, a scarred visage, too pale skin, and pale gold eyes. Fire Nation eyes. Heart clenching, he squeezed his eyes shut as if by doing so he could somehow erase the color as well. He had traveled to Omashu to discover more about who he was and where he had come from, but not like this. Never like this. Something heavy rustled in front of him, the sound of fabric being pushed aside. He heard a gasp and then the thud of knees hitting the ground. Two hands gripped his arms. "Lee!" A voice cried, frantic with worry. "Lee, are you all right?" Lee raised his face from his knees and met the concerned gray eyes that stared back at him. Aang smiled in relief. Half-forgotten words rushed back into Lee's mind. You're a good person, Lee. No matter what anyone else tells you, I hope that you will remember that. There's something you're not telling me, isn't there? It's complicated. Let's just say I think it'll be safer for everyone if you keep that mask on. The pain squeezing Lee's heart intensified, but this time there was anger as well. You knew, he accused hoarsely, breaking away from Aang's grip so that the boy almost stumbled backwards. You knew this whole time. Aang regained his balance and stared at Lee with wide, startled eyes. Knew what? Lee let out a hiss of frustration and removed the mask from his face, revealing his skewed features and pale gold eyes. At first I thought you told me to keep the mask on because of my scar, but now I know that it's because I simply don't look like other people from the Earth Kingdom or Water Tribes. His fingers tightened around the wooden mask. I've seen green eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes, even gray like yours. But no one has gold eyes. The only people whose eye color is similar are the Fire Nation. Aang finished for him, and then lowered his gaze. I know. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. Lee slipped the mask back on his face and looked the other way. I'm guessing I must be of mixed blood, he said more quietly. You get them sometimes in the Earth Kingdom. Not that many people like half-bloods. A bitter laugh. No wonder I chose to wear a mask. Aang started circling his thumbs round and round each other. What if you weren't of mixed blood? He asked, not raising his eyes. What if you really were just from the Fire Nation? Lee's head throbbed a little more violently, whispering of puzzle pieces of memory that still needed to be fitted together. However, the only image he could see in his mind was of the young girl burning the Earth Kingdom doll to ashes, the same girl who had later struck him with lightning on a boat made of Fire Nation steel. Azula. I'm not like them, Lee said, clenching his hands into fists. I can't be like them. He hated the way his voice broke, exposing his distress and guilt. He didn't want to think that he had no scrap of redeeming blood in him. The people of the Fire Nation were monsters, he was living proof of that. The scar on the left side of his face had not been made by a waterbender, and it was their princess who had tried to murder him that day on the ocean. He wouldn't, accept that his heritage could only ever amount to one of fire and blood. Besides, he could heal, couldn't he? That had to mean something, but it didn't. Because water had never responded to him, and his skin was too pale and his eyes too gold, and he just wished he had never stepped foot onto that platform. He didn't want this. He didn't want this at all. You know, Aang said, choosing his words carefully, I once told you that before the war I had a friend from the Fire Nation. His name was Kuzan. I remember. Then you'll know that I'm right when I say it's not our nation or our blood that makes us who we are. It's the choices we make. Lee stared at him for a long moment. Maybe you're right, he allowed, but you and I both know that means nothing to the people who the Fire Nation has hurt. His voice took on a bitter edge. Isn't that why you told me to keep wearing the mask? You were afraid of how your friends might react if they knew the truth. Aang dropped his gaze to the floor, his face downcast. The silence that filled the space between them was tense and filled with unspoken words, but it was also the only confirmation Lee needed. He gripped his knees more tightly and looked the other way, conscious of the hard lump forming in his throat. I want to be alone for a while, he said in a flat voice. But I said I want to be alone. Lee growled, swinging back around to glare at him. Aang held his hands up in an appeasing gesture. Okay. I'm leaving. Lee said nothing and stared back across his knees at the tent. His eyes narrowed as the bubbling mixture of rage and hurt battered against his ribcage, screaming to break free. It was a relief when he heard the rustle of fabric being pushed aside, but then Aang paused on the threshold. I hope you know this doesn't change anything between us. I still want to be your friend, if you'll let me. Lee remained silent. He thought he heard Aang sigh and then everything went quiet. When he glanced back towards the door, Aang was gone. It didn't make him feel any better. Oh. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky like tiny pearls scattered on a sea of purples and blues. Katara frowned at the tent. He still hasn't come out, she muttered, and stood up from where she had been sitting by the fire. I'm going to go check on him. Aang said that Lee wanted to be left alone, Sokka reminded her, not raising his eyes from the ship he was carving in his hand. But he'll talk to us when he's ready. She sighed and sat back down. I guess you're right. I just hope he's okay. You saw what happened to him on the platform. I doubt that Aang would have left his side if he thought that Lee was still in a critical condition. Sokka turned his head to look towards the hills that surrounded Omashu. Speaking of Aang, what's taking him so long? He should have been back by now. Katara followed the direction of her brother's gaze. You don't think anything happened to him, do you? He was only going to drop the baby off at the governor's house. How hard can that be? She opened her mouth to respond, but then she saw a masked figure emerge from the tent. Suddenly, she was back on her feet. Lee! She exclaimed, walking towards him. How are you feeling? Fine. He paused and surveyed the campsite. Where's Bumi? Katara frowned. Didn't Aang tell you? Tell me what? Bumi stayed behind, Sokka explained, placing his knife and the wooden figure he had been carving down on the ground. He said he needed to listen and wait for the right moment to strike, or something like that. Lee's hands curled into fists. I see. Katara placed her hand on his arm. You were hoping he could give you some information about the path of the ancient ways, right? Aang mentioned as much to us. He wrenched himself free of her grip. Well, it's nice to know the Avatar has seen fit to share everything about me with you. Tell me, is there anything he hasn't told you? Because I seem to be the only person who doesn't know anything around here. She stared at his masked face, at his tense shoulders and clenched fists. In that moment, he reminded her of a coiled spring waiting to be unleashed. A crease formed on her brow. Are you angry? He let out a small breath and turned his back on her. No, he said quietly. It's nothing. Forget it. She exchanged a glance with her brother, who shrugged and held his hands up in the air as if to say he didn't know why Lee was getting all worked up either. Katara frowned and took a step closer to Lee. You know, she said gently, Aang only told us about your amnesia because he didn't want us to bother you with too many questions. He said you wouldn't like that. And he only told us about your search for the path of the ancient ways because Sokka kept pestering him about what your intentions were for coming with us to find King Bumi. What? Sokka demanded when they both turned to look at him. No offense, Lee, but we've only known you for a few days. I was just being cautious. No, you were being rude, she responded, placing her hand on her hip. Sokka opened his mouth to retort, but Lee got there before him. Look, I don't care about any of that. I'm sure I would have behaved exactly the same if I were in your position. Then what's wrong? Katara asked, glancing back up at him in a vain attempt to meet his gaze. Nothing, he repeated. I'm just tired and I wish this stupid headache would go away. He rubbed the side of his head, as if just mentioning it had made the pain worse. She twisted her lips into a frown. Is it because of what happened today when you, lost it? Sokka supplied. She glared at her brother. That is not what I was going to say. No, but it's true, Lee said flatly. He sighed and sat on the ground, staring hard at the fire. I don't know what happened. Sometimes I get headaches when I sense that something is familiar to me or when a memory returns. Today it was just worse, I guess. Katara sat next to him. You know, you really scared us this morning. None of us knew why you collapsed like that, and then you wouldn't stop shaking. She stared down at her lap. I was really worried about you. He gave her a swift glance. You don't even know me. Maybe not, she allowed, but that doesn't mean I don't care. Lee said nothing. Instead he just stared at her, his mask glinting with the orange glow of the fire. Katara wished she could see his expression to know what he was thinking. The demonic grin painted onto his blue spirit disguise didn't exactly reveal much. Still, she thought she might have surprised him with her remark. Somehow, she got the feeling that no one had showed him much affection before. It made her that much more determined to prove to him that not everyone was out to get him. Some people genuinely did just care, like her. Sokka rubbed his chin in thought. Hold on. You said that you get these headaches when you sense that something is familiar to you. Does that mean you recognized those girls we fought today? Lee nodded. That girl with the blue fire, Angela, she tried to kill me once. I don't know why or when. I just know that it happened. Katara had to resist the urge to grip his hand. I'm sorry. It's no wonder you had such a bad reaction to her. Don't be, he said dismissively. I don't think that was the first time someone tried to kill me. He threw the bit of dried grass that he had been fidgeting with into the fire and his voice lowered as if he were speaking more to himself. But if I ever see her again, I'll make sure that she pays for what she did. Katara watched the grass shrivel to nothing as it was consumed by the flames. She didn't doubt the sincerity of his words, nor did she think it was a bad thing that he wanted to get revenge. Her fingers closed around the necklace hanging from her throat. There were some grievances that could not be forgiven. Oblivious to his sister's darker thoughts, Sokka leaned back on his palms and considered Lee. It's a pity you don't remember more of your past. It sounds like you've had a lot of dealings with the Fire Nation. We could use that kind of information. Lee twitched. What makes you think I know anything about the Fire Nation? Apart from the fact that they all want to kill you. Katara frowned at her brother. You know, Sokka, there is such a thing as having tact. Maybe you should learn to use it sometime. He rolled his eyes. Thank you, O condescending one. Look, all I'm saying is that Lee obviously knew his stuff before he lost all his memories. How else would he have known where to find Aang when he got captured by Admiral Sideburns? It's not exactly difficult to sneak into a fortress, Lee said with a shrug. I got into Omashu fine without being seen and I'm pretty sure I've never been to that city before. Sokka pursed his lips, perhaps remembering their own less than graceful method of entering the city through the sewers. Right. Well, freakish stealth skills aside, that still doesn't explain why you were near Pahue's stronghold in the first place, let alone how you knew that Aang had been captured. I guess we'll never know, Lee responded with a bitter edge to his voice, because I don't even remember rescuing the Avatar, and I still have no leads for finding more about the path of the ancient ways. Katara was about to speak when a flash of a different kind of orange caught her attention. She looked up to see Aang drop to the ground in front of them, spinning his glider shut as he did so. Momo and Appa immediately came over to greet their friend, Appa lathering the airbender with slobbery kisses while Momo chirrupied and jumped up and down on his shoulder. Aang laughed and gave each a friendly pat, then paused. What? He said. Have I got Appa drool all over my face? Well, yes, Sokka admitted, but that's not the point. How did it go? Oh, fine. A smile curved Aang's mouth. The governor and his wife both seemed really happy to have their son back. What took you so long? Katara asked. We were getting worried. Aang's grin faltered. I was going to visit Bumi again just to say goodbye, you know, since I don't know when I'll next see him again, but in the end I decided it was too dangerous. They've got guards swarming all around the place. Lee stood up. Maybe too dangerous for you, but not for me. I'm going back. I can't just sit here when there's still a chance that old man has the information I need. Wait. Aang gripped his arm. I already asked Bumi about the path of the ancient ways for you. Why didn't you tell me earlier? What did he say? Aang frowned. Well, actually he just laughed and told me the same thing that he always says. Which is? That you had to stop thinking about the obvious and open your mind to the possibilities. Aang shrugged. He said that only then would you find what you're looking for. Lee made a frustrated noise. Great. A riddle to answer a riddle. Now what am I supposed to do? Katara had to cover her mouth to stifle her laughter. Why don't you come with us? She suggested. What? Lee said, sounding quite surprised. You might as well, Sokka said, leaning his chin on his hand. We'll be leaving tomorrow to look for a new earthbending teacher for Aang. Maybe we can help you find what you're looking for as well. Lee shook his head. I work better alone. But it was an empty excuse at best, and as the three of them continued to pressure him into staying, Katara could tell that he hadn't quite dismissed the offer from his mind. In the end, it was Momo who made the decision for him. The winged lemur landed on Lee's head and made a few chirrups before curling up into a ball so that he resembled a furry hat. It seems that Momo has spoken, Katara observed, looking at Lee with a smile. I guess you'll just have to stay. And somehow that really was that. A bed was made for him inside the tent and the bag he had collected that morning from outside the city walls was placed beside their own. He didn't speak much to them for the rest of that night, but Katara still thought it was a good beginning. For some reason, their little gang just felt more complete with him there, as if the space he had come to fill had always been designed for him. She knew that they had made the right decision to let him join their group. Still, there was one thing that troubled her. She had not forgotten about the wall of fire she had sensed surrounding his mind, nor the peculiar whisper of energy she had felt intermingled with the flames. You rise with the moon. I rise with the sun. Katara shoved the thought aside before it could take proper root in her mind, refusing to even indulge in the idea. It was just a coincidence that their energy felt similar, just like it had at first surprised her to hear Lee speak in those raspy tones she had only ever associated with one person. For all she knew, that might just be what fire felt like, and who was to say that a firebender hadn't done something to Lee's mind? Stop being stupid, Katara, she scolded herself. You know that Lee isn't Zuko, so why do you keep fretting over the matter? She had no answer for that, but in the end it didn't matter. She'd already banished the thought from her mind once, it was easy enough to do it again. And if it took her a bit longer to fall asleep that night, well, she chose not to dwell on the reasons for why. What mattered was that Lee was with them now. What mattered was that he was safe, and Katara knew that she would do her utmost to help him. After all, Lee was part of the family now. Oh. The moon stretched her hands far into the night, bathing the world in a veil of silver. Lee frowned and glanced back towards the tent where the others were sleeping. He wondered why he had agreed to stay with them. He wondered why he even wanted to continue with this med journey. You could still turn back, a voice whispered in his mind. Lee resisted the urge to clamp his hands over his ears. He was sick of hearing that voice. It had been pestering him from the moment he had first woken up and realized that he had Fire Nation blood in him. It was the voice of fear, of cowardice, and weakness, and it was far too persuasive for its own good. Back in Phase Town, he had been offered a chance to forget about his past and start again as Lee the Earth Kingdom boy. It would have been a new life, one that was still possible for him to have if he just gave up this quest for knowledge and returned to the healer's house. He knew that Faye and her family would welcome him. There was nothing to stop him from going back, nothing but his own inexplicable need to keep moving forward. There were still things that he didn't know, and even though it frightened him to think what else he might learn about his past, it seemed so much worse to just turn back now simply because he didn't like what his memories were telling him. Lee pulled out the dagger from his tunic and unsheathed the blade, examining the characters that had been etched onto the side. Someone had given this dagger to him. Someone had wanted him to read that message and let it sink into his heart, so that he would know what to do when those difficult decisions were placed before him. So that he would know how to face his fears, even when all hope seemed lost. He closed his eyes, tightening his grip on the dagger. I won't give up, he whispered. Check the description for the links to the author.